Two men, two minds, one question that would reshape how humanity understands itself. David Hume died peacefully in Edinburgh in 1776, joking with friends about meeting Charon, the ferryman of the dead. He asked for a few more years to see the downfall of organized religion. His doctor, watching him laugh at death itself, called it the most cheerful deathbed he had ever witnessed. No fear, no prayers, just a man who had spent his life questioning everything, comfortable with the nothingness he believed awaited him. Across Europe, in a small Prussian town, a 52-year-old professor named Immanuel Kant received news of Hume's death. Kant had never traveled more than 60 miles from Königsberg. He never married. His neighbors set their watches by his afternoon walks, so precise was his routine. Yet this man, who seemed to live the smallest possible life, was constructing an intellectual revolution that would dwarf the political revolutions erupting around him. Hume's treatise of human nature, written when he was 26, fell stillborn from the press, as he later wrote. Almost nobody read it. The book that would eventually reshape philosophy was initially ignored. Hume rewrote his ideas in simpler forms, became a celebrity in Paris, grew wealthy, and died believing his philosophical works had failed. He was wrong. Within decades, his arguments about causation would become inescapable. Every philosopher would have to answer Hume. Kant's critique of pure reason, published when he was 57, was nearly unreadable. Sentences stretched for paragraphs. Arguments nested within arguments. Students complained. Colleagues were baffled. Yet within years, it was being called the most important philosophical work since Plato. Kant had to rewrite sections because even sympathetic readers could not follow his reasoning. But the core idea was irresistible. What if the human mind does not discover the world but constructs it? These two men never met. They never corresponded. Kant read Hume in German translation, years after publication. Yet their dialogue became the central conversation of modern philosophy. Hume's skeptical empiricism versus Kant's transcendental idealism. Experience versus reason. Sentiment versus duty. Nature versus freedom. Every major philosophical debate of the past 2 centuries traces back to the tension between these two visions. Hume believed that reason is powerless. We are creatures of habit and sentiment. We believe the sun will rise tomorrow not because logic demands it, but because we cannot help ourselves. Custom, not rationality, governs human life. Causation is a feeling, not a fact. The self is a fiction. Morality comes from sympathy, not from divine command or rational principle. We are animals with sophisticated nervous systems, nothing more, nothing less. Kant believed the opposite. Reason is everything. It structures our experience of reality. Space and time are not out there, they are in here. Forms our minds impose on sensation. Causation is not learned from experience, but required for experience to be possible at all. The self is the necessary unity that holds consciousness together. Morality is rational law, binding on all beings capable of reason. We are not merely animals. We are autonomous agents, legislators of our own moral law, possessing a dignity that transcends nature. One of them has to be wrong. Or do they? Hume argued that we cannot justify belief in cause and effect. You see one billiard ball strike another, the second moves. Did the first cause the second to move? You never see causation itself, only sequence. You observe constant conjunction and form a habit of expectation. But habit is not logic. The future might not resemble the past. You have no rational ground for believing it will, yet you believe anyway. Nature compels you. This argument threatened the foundations of science. If causal reasoning has no justification, then physics is just elaborate bookkeeping of past regularities. Newton's laws might stop working tomorrow. Science cannot claim certainty, only probability based on custom. Hume wrote this. Then he ate dinner and played cards because philosophical skepticism cannot survive contact with ordinary life. Kant read Hume and experienced what he later called an awakening from dogmatic slumber. Everything he had been taught, that pure reason could discover truths about reality, suddenly seemed naive. But Hume's skepticism was intolerable. There had to be a way to secure scientific knowledge without claiming to know things as they are in themselves. Kant spent the next decade working out his answer. We cannot know the thing in itself, but we can know the necessary structure of experience. Causation is not observed in nature, it is imposed by the mind. And because all human minds impose the same structures, scientific knowledge is universal and necessary for us. The implications were staggering. Hume's skepticism led to naturalism. We are parts of nature, explained by natural laws. There is no ghost in the machine, no soul separate from the body, no freedom outside the causal order. Morality is a human invention, useful but not objectively true. Religion is superstition refined by philosophy into something less obviously absurd. Kant's critique led to idealism. We cannot step outside our own cognitive structures to see reality as it truly is. The phenomenal world, the world we experience, is partly our construction. But this means science is secure within its domain, and it means there is room for freedom, God, and morality beyond the phenomenal realm. Kant limited knowledge to make room for faith, not religious faith in revelation, but rational faith in the conditions necessary for moral life. 250 years later, their debate is everywhere. Artificial intelligence. Should neural networks learn from data like Hume suggested, or do they need built-in structures like Kant proposed? Neuroscience. Is consciousness constructed from sensory input, or does the brain impose organization on chaos? Ethics. Is morality based on empathy and consequences, or on rational principles and duties? Science. Is knowledge built from observations, or does theory shape what we observe? Every time you argue about whether morality is objective or subjective, you are arguing Hume versus Kant. Every time you debate whether artificial intelligence can truly understand or merely processes patterns, you are debating Hume versus Kant. Every time you wonder whether you are truly free or just a product of your circumstances, you are wondering what Hume and Kant wondered. David Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711 to a family of minor Scottish gentry. His father died when he was 2. The family had little money. At 12, Hume entered the University of Edinburgh to study law, but he abandoned it. Philosophy consumed him. By his early 20s, he had conceived the ideas that would define his career. He moved to France, lived cheaply in La Flèche, and at 26 published A Treatise of Human Nature. The book fell, as he later wrote, stillborn from the press. Almost no one read it. Hume returned to Scotland, worked as a tutor, then as a librarian. He rewrote his ideas in shorter, clearer forms. Essays concerning human understanding appeared in 1748. The inquiry concerning the principles of morals followed in 1751. Recognition came slowly. Hume never held an academic position. Universities rejected him for irreligion. He made his living through writing and eventually served as a diplomat in Paris, where French intellectuals lionized him. He was sociable, enjoyed wine and conversation, played cards, grew fat and cheerful. He died in Edinburgh in 1776, unafraid, telling friends that annihilation was nothing to fear. Immanuel Kant was born in Königsberg in 1724, 13 years after Hume. His father was a harness maker. The family was devoutly pietist, a strict Protestant sect that emphasized inner devotion and moral discipline. Kant attended the University of Königsberg at 16. After his father died, he worked as a private tutor for several years to support himself. At 31, he received a position at the university as a Privatdozent, paid directly by students who attended his lectures. He taught logic, metaphysics, geography, anthropology, mathematics, physics. He lectured for 15 years without a salaried professorship. Finally, at 46, he became a full professor. Kant never traveled more than 60 miles from Königsberg. He never married. His daily routine became legendary for its precision. He woke at 5, drank tea, smoked his pipe, prepared lectures. After teaching, he wrote until lunch at 1. Neighbors set their clocks by his afternoon walk. He ate 1 meal per day, always with company, always with conversation. He worked, walked, slept at the same times for decades. In 1781, at 57, he published The Critique of Pure Reason. The book was difficult, dense, nearly unreadable. But within a few years, it transformed European philosophy. 2 more critiques followed. Kant continued teaching and writing until his mental faculties began failing in his early 70s. He died in 1804 at 79, reportedly with the word enough on his lips. The contrast was stark. Hume was convivial, comfortable with uncertainty, skeptical of grand systems. Kant was solitary, systematic, driven to secure certainty through reason. Hume wrote with clarity and wit. Kant wrote with technical precision that sometimes collapsed into obscurity. Hume trusted experience and observed how humans actually think. Kant sought the necessary structures that make thinking possible. Yet both men addressed the same crisis. The old metaphysics, inherited from medieval theology and elaborated by 17th century rationalists, had become untenable. Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and Christian Wolff had built vast systems deduced from first principles. These systems claimed knowledge of God, the soul, substance, causation, freedom, all derived through pure reason without reference to experience. But the systems contradicted each other. Worse, they seemed disconnected from the new science. Newton had explained planetary motion and gravity through mathematics and observation, not through deductions about substance. The question emerged: what can human beings actually know, and how do we know it? Hume answered with radical skepticism tempered by natural belief. Kant answered by limiting knowledge to make room for faith and securing science on new foundations. Both rejected the old metaphysics. Both placed limits on human cognition, but their limits pointed in opposite directions. Hume restricted knowledge to impressions, ideas, and the habits formed by constant conjunction. We have no rational justification for believing in causation, external objects, or the self. We believe anyway because nature compels us. Kant restricted knowledge to possible experience, but insisted that experience itself has a rational structure. Space, time, causation, and substance are not learned from experience, but are conditions that make experience possible. We cannot know things as they are in themselves, but we can know the laws governing how things must appear to us. The two men never met. Hume died before Kant's major works appeared, but Kant read Hume in German translation. The impact was profound. Kant had been trained in Wolffian metaphysics, a systematic philosophy that treated reason as capable of discovering truths about reality through logic alone. Hume's skepticism shattered that confidence. Kant later wrote that Hume interrupted his dogmatic slumber. The phrase has become famous, but its meaning is precise. Kant did not mean that Hume woke him from general complacency. He meant that Hume exposed the dogmatism of rationalist metaphysics, the unquestioned assumption that reason alone could deliver knowledge of how things really are. Kant spent the next decade working out his response. The response was not a refutation of Hume. It was an attempt to salvage what Hume had threatened. Kant agreed that experience cannot justify certain beliefs, but he argued that experience presupposes structures built into the mind itself. These structures are not learned. They cannot be doubted without making doubt itself impossible. This move allowed Kant to accept Hume's empiricist insights while rejecting his skeptical conclusions. Knowledge requires both sensory input and rational form. Neither alone is sufficient. The question seems simple. Its answer determines everything else. Both Hume and Kant began here, and both rejected the answers that had dominated philosophy for centuries. The rationalist claimed that reason alone could discover fundamental truths. Descartes doubted everything except his own thinking. From that certainty, he deduced God's existence, the external world, the distinction between mind and body. Spinoza constructed an entire metaphysical system geometrically, proposing definitions and deriving theorems. Leibniz argued for pre-established harmony and monads, indivisible substances that mirror the universe. Wolff systematized Leibniz into a teachable philosophy, claiming that logic could reveal the nature of reality. These thinkers believed that the world has a rational structure and that human reason can grasp it through analysis and deduction. The British empiricists rejected this. John Locke argued that the mind at birth is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and all knowledge comes from experience. George Berkeley claimed that material substance is incoherent and that only minds and ideas exist. Hume pushed empiricism further. He distinguished between two kinds of mental content, impressions and ideas. Impressions are vivid, immediate experiences, sensations, emotions, perceptions. Ideas are faint copies of impressions, used in thinking and reasoning. All ideas trace back to impressions. If you cannot point to an impression from which an idea derives, the idea is meaningless. This principle became Hume's weapon. Consider the idea of substance. Rationalists claimed that properties inhere in an underlying substrate, a substance that persists beneath changing qualities. But what impression gives rise to this idea? We see colors, feel textures, hear sounds. We never perceive substance itself, only its supposed qualities. The idea of substance, Hume concluded, is fiction. We group qualities together out of habit and imagine a unifying thing beneath them. The same applies to the self. We experience thoughts, feelings, sensations. We never experience a self that has these experiences. The self is a bundle of perceptions, nothing more. Causation faced the harshest scrutiny. We observe one event following another. The billiard ball strikes, the second ball moves. We repeat the observation and form a habit. We expect the second ball to move when struck. But do we observe causation itself? Do we see a necessary connection between cause and effect? Hume said no. We see sequence, contiguity, and constant conjunction. The mind infers causation from repeated experience. But this inference has no logical justification. The future might not resemble the past. Nature might change its patterns tomorrow. We have no rational ground for assuming uniformity. We assume it anyway because habit and instinct compel us. This threatened the foundations of knowledge. Science depends on causal reasoning. If causation is merely psychological habit, then scientific laws describe regularities we have observed, not necessary truths about the world. Geometry and arithmetic remain certain, but only because they concern relations of ideas, not matters of fact. 2 + 2 = 4 by definition. Bachelors are unmarried by definition. These truths are trivial. They tell us nothing about existence. All substantial knowledge, knowledge of what actually exists, depends on experience, and experience cannot guarantee truth. Kant read this and recognized the danger. If Hume was right, science had no secure foundation. Newtonian physics might be a useful summary of observations, but it could not claim necessity. Worse, morality and freedom seemed impossible. If all events follow from prior causes according to natural law, human actions are no different from billiard balls. Moral responsibility requires freedom. Freedom requires escaping causal determinism. But Hume left no room for escape. Kant's solution began with a question Hume had not asked. Hume asked where our ideas come from. Kant asked what makes experience possible. Experience is not a chaotic stream of sensations. It has structure. We perceive objects in space and time. We recognize causes and effects. We distinguish substances from properties. These structures are not optional features of experience. They are preconditions. Without them, experience itself would be impossible. Consider space. We see objects as located to the left or right, near or far, inside or outside. Spatial relations organize sensory input, but do we learn space from experience? Kant argued no. To experience objects as spatially related presupposes that space is already available as a framework. We cannot derive space from experience because experience already assumes it. Space, then, is not a feature of things as they are in themselves. It is a form of human sensibility, the way our minds structure sensory information. The same applies to time. Events occur earlier or later, simultaneously or successively. Temporal relations structure experience, but time itself is not experienced. It is the condition under which experience occurs. We cannot step outside time to observe it. We cannot experience timelessness. Time is the form of inner sense, the structure through which we experience our own mental states. Space and time, Kant concluded, are a priori forms of intuition. A priori means prior to experience, not derived from it. Intuition means immediate acquaintance, not conceptual thought. We intuit objects in space and time before we conceptualize them. This explains the certainty of geometry. Geometric truths hold necessarily because they describe the spatial structure imposed by our minds. Euclidean geometry is not a contingent fact about the world. It is a necessary feature of how humans experience the world. But space and time alone do not yield knowledge. Sensory input must be organized conceptually. Kant called these organizing concepts categories. The category of causation imposes order on temporal succession. When we perceive one event following another repeatedly, the category of causation makes us interpret the sequence as necessary connection. The category of substance makes us interpret changing perceptions as properties of enduring objects. The categories are not learned from experience. They are rules the mind applies to make experience intelligible. This was Kant's answer to Hume. Causation is not merely psychological habit. It is a necessary condition for experience. We cannot experience a world without causal structure because our minds impose that structure. Hume was right that we never perceive causation directly, but he was wrong to conclude that causation is merely habitual expectation. Causation is a priori, a rule the understanding applies to temporal sequences. Without it, experience would dissolve into disconnected sensations. Kant agreed with Hume that we cannot know things as they are in themselves, independent of experience. He called such things noumena. We can only know phenomena, things as they appear to us under the conditions of space, time, and the categories. This places limits on knowledge. Metaphysical questions about the soul, God, and freedom cannot be answered through theoretical reason. These concepts do not apply to possible experience. They transcend the boundaries of human cognition. Yet this limitation secures science. Newtonian physics describes how objects necessarily appear to beings with our cognitive structure. It does not describe things in themselves, but it does describe phenomena with certainty. Scientific laws are not mere summaries of observations. They express necessary truths about possible experience. This rescues science from Hume's skepticism without returning to rationalist dogmatism. The debate comes into focus. Hume asked what we can derive from experience. Kant asked what experience presupposes. Hume concluded that reason is the slave of the passions, that belief rests on custom, that knowledge is limited to impressions and the ideas copied from them. Kant concluded that reason legislates to nature, that the mind imposes structure on sensation, that knowledge is limited to possible experience but certain within those limits. Both agreed that old metaphysics was dead. Both placed boundaries on human knowledge. But where Hume saw limits leading to skepticism and naturalism, Kant saw limits enabling certainty and preserving space for morality. Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding appeared in 1748. Section 7 bears the title of The Idea of Necessary Connection. The argument within became one of philosophy's most enduring challenges. We believe the future will resemble the past. We believe causes produce effects. We believe nature operates according to regular laws. Every prediction, every plan, every scientific inference depends on these beliefs. Yet Hume asked what justifies them. His answer, nothing does. Consider the billiard ball example. One ball rolls across the table and strikes another. The second ball moves. Observe this repeatedly and you will expect the same result each time. Strike the first ball, the second moves. The connection seems obvious. The first ball causes the second to move. But what exactly do you observe? You observe the first ball moving. You observe contact between the balls. You observe the second ball beginning to move. You observe spatial contiguity. The balls touch. You observe temporal succession. The second ball moves after the first strikes. You observe constant conjunction. This sequence has occurred every time. But do you observe causation itself? Do you observe a necessary connection forcing the second ball to move? Hume insisted you do not. You observe motion, contact, sequence. You never observe the power or force that supposedly makes the second ball move. You cannot see necessity. You cannot feel it. You cannot detect it through any sense. The idea of necessary connection does not come from any impression of the external world. Perhaps it comes from internal experience. When you will your arm to move, it moves. You feel effort. You observe the result. Does this reveal causation? Hume said no. You observe the volition and the movement. You do not observe the connection between them. You do not understand how mental effort produces physical motion. The connection remains mysterious. What you feel is the volition itself, not the power by which it operates. The idea of causation, then, does not derive from any impression, external or internal. Yet we possess the idea. We use it constantly. Where does it come from? Hume's answer, from habit. After observing constant conjunction, the same sequence repeated many times, the mind forms an expectation. When you see the first ball strike, your mind automatically anticipates the second ball moving. This anticipation is not a conclusion reached through reasoning. It is a psychological compulsion. The imagination, conditioned by repetition, leaps from perception to expectation. This leap feels necessary, but the feeling of necessity is just that, a feeling. It does not reflect any objective connection in the world. Causation, on this account, is a projection. We experience constant conjunction and feel compelled to expect continuance. We project this compulsion onto the world and imagine that events are connected by necessary ties. But necessity exists only in the mind. The world contains sequences, regularities, patterns. It does not contain necessary connections. This conclusion threatens the foundation of empirical knowledge. Science seeks causal explanations. Newton explained planetary orbits by gravitational attraction. Chemists explain reactions by molecular structure. Biologists explain inheritance by genes. All these explanations assume causation is real, that causes necessitate their effects. If Hume is right, these explanations merely describe observed regularities. They cannot guarantee that future observations will match past ones. The problem extends beyond science. Every practical decision assumes causal reasoning. You eat because food has relieved hunger before. You avoid fire because it has caused pain before. You plant seeds expecting crops because seeds have grown before. If past conjunction provides no rational warrant for future expectation, then every action based on experience is irrational. Hume acknowledged this implication. He did not deny that we rely on causal reasoning. He denied that causal reasoning has rational justification. Nature, not reason, makes us believe. We cannot help forming expectations based on experience. Custom and habit govern belief more powerfully than logic. This is not a defect. It is how human cognition operates. We are creatures of habit, not pure reason. The argument has three layers. First, necessity is not observed. Second, necessity is not logically derivable. Third, necessity is psychologically projected. Each layer deepens the skepticism. That necessity is not observed follows from empiricism. All ideas come from impressions. Causation is an idea, but no impression corresponds to it. Therefore, causation as necessary connection is not justified by experience. That necessity is not logically derivable follows from the nature of causal inference. Causal reasoning moves from observed instances to unobserved instances. We observe that fire has produced heat in the past. We infer that fire will produce heat in the future. But this inference assumes that nature is uniform, that the future resembles the past. What justifies this assumption? It cannot be justified by logic alone. There is no contradiction in imagining that the future differs from the past. You can coherently conceive of fire suddenly producing cold tomorrow. Logic forbids contradiction, not surprising changes in nature. So the uniformity of nature cannot be a logical truth. Can experience justify it? Every appeal to experience assumes what needs proving. You might argue that nature has been uniform so far, so it will likely remain uniform. But this reasoning uses causal inference to justify causal inference. It assumes the future will resemble the past in order to conclude that the future will resemble the past. The argument is circular. No escape appears. Causal reasoning cannot be justified by logic or experience, yet we engage in it constantly. Hume concluded that causal reasoning is instinctive. Reason has no foundation to offer. Custom provides the foundation instead. That necessity is psychologically projected completes the account. We do not discover necessity in the world. We feel compelled to expect certain sequences. This feeling arises from repeated experience. After observing constant conjunction, the mind associates ideas. When one appears, the other comes to mind automatically. This association feels inevitable. We mistake the psychological inevitability for metaphysical necessity. We project our mental habits onto reality. Hume called this sentiment or feeling a determination of the mind. Experience produces a habit. The habit produces an expectation. The expectation feels necessary, but the necessity is subjective. It describes how our minds work, not how the world works. The implications ripple outward. If causation is projection, then laws of nature are descriptions of regularities, not discoveries of necessities. If induction has no rational basis, then science cannot claim certainty. If belief rests on custom, then reason plays a smaller role than philosophers had assumed. Hume did not advocate paralysis. He distinguished between philosophical skepticism and practical life. In philosophy, we recognize that causal reasoning lacks justification. In practice, we continue reasoning causally because nature gives us no choice. Skepticism cannot survive outside the study. Habit reasserts itself the moment philosophical reflection ends. This division between theory and practice troubled many readers. If causal reasoning is irrational, why trust it at all? Hume's response, because we must. Nature has designed humans to form beliefs based on experience. This design serves us well. We survive by learning from past experience. The fact that this learning has no rational foundation does not make it useless. It makes philosophy humbler. Critics attacked from multiple angles. Some argued that Hume smuggled causation back in. He spoke of repeated experience producing habits. But production is a causal notion. If causation is illusory, how can experience cause anything, including belief? Hume might reply that he described psychological regularities, not metaphysical causation, but the tension remains. Others argued that Hume's skepticism refutes itself. If all belief rests on habit, then Hume's own skeptical arguments rest on habit too. Why trust them? Hume accepted this. He did not claim his arguments were certain. He claimed they accurately described how human cognition works. This description itself depends on experience and induction, but that does not make it false. The most profound response came decades later from Kant. Kant agreed that experience alone cannot justify causation, but he denied that causation is mere habit. Causation is a precondition for experience. Without it, we could not organize sensations into a coherent world. This answer shifts the question. Hume asked what we learn from experience. Kant asked what makes experience possible. The billiard ball problem was the spark. Kant's response would reshape philosophy. Kant read Hume in 1772, probably in a German translation by Johann Georg Sulzer. The Critique of Pure Reason would not appear until 1781. Between these dates lay what Kant called his silent decade, a period of intense rethinking during which he wrote almost nothing for publication. In the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, published in 1783, Kant described what happened. He wrote that Hume's challenge interrupted his dogmatic slumber. The phrase requires precision. Kant did not mean that he had been intellectually lazy. He meant that he had accepted certain philosophical assumptions without examining their foundations. These assumptions came from Christian Wolff, the German systematizer of Leibnizian philosophy. Wolffian philosophy dominated German universities in Kant's youth. Wolff had constructed a comprehensive system covering logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, and theology. The system proceeded by definitions and deductions. From the principle of sufficient reason, everything has a reason for being as it is rather than otherwise. Wolff derived claims about substance, causation, God, and the soul. The method was mathematical. Philosophy should achieve the same certainty as geometry. Reason alone, properly applied, could discover truths about reality. Kant absorbed this approach. His early works, written in the 1750s and 1760s, operated within the Wolffian framework. He refined arguments, clarified concepts, proposed modifications. But he did not question the fundamental assumption that pure reason could deliver metaphysical knowledge. This was the dogmatic slumber. not carelessness, but unexamined confidence in rationalist method. Hume's skepticism shattered that confidence. The attack on causation was decisive. Wolffian metaphysics treated causation as a rational principle. Every event has a sufficient reason. Effects follow necessarily from causes. These claims were supposedly knowable a priori, through reason alone, without dependence on experience. But Hume showed that causation cannot be observed and cannot be logically derived. If Hume was right, then Wolffian metaphysics rested on nothing. Reason had no access to necessary connections. The entire edifice collapsed. Kant did not embrace Hume's skepticism. He sought to rescue what Hume threatened. The Wolffian system was wrong, but science was not. Newton's physics worked. It predicted phenomena accurately. It unified diverse observations under mathematical laws. Science could not be mere habit and custom. It required objective validity. Somehow, causal reasoning had to be more than psychological compulsion. Yet Hume's critique seemed irrefutable. The solution emerged slowly. Kant began by accepting Hume's empiricist insight. We cannot know things as they are in themselves, independent of experience. But he rejected Hume's conclusion that this leaves knowledge uncertain. Instead, Kant asked a different question. Not what do we learn from experience, but what are the conditions that make experience possible? This shift was radical. Hume analyzed experienced events and found no necessity in them. Kant analyzed the structure of experience itself and found necessity there. Experience is not a passive reception of data, it is an active construction. The mind does not simply receive impressions, it organizes them according to rules. These rules are not learned from experience, they are preconditions for having experience at all. Consider the simplest perception, seeing an object. You look at a table, you see a brown rectangular surface with 4 legs. This seems straightforward. Light enters your eyes, produces sensations, you perceive the table. But Kant argued that perception requires synthesis. The sensations must be unified into a single object. Different moments of seeing must be connected into a continuous perception. The spatial parts must be related as belonging to one thing. None of this happens automatically. The mind actively combines sensory manifold into unified experience. This synthesis requires rules. The rule of substance unifies changing perceptions as properties of an enduring thing. The rule of causation connects temporal sequences as cause and effect. The rule of space organizes sensations into external relations. These rules are categories of the understanding. They are not abstracted from experience. They structure experience from the beginning. Causation, then, is not a feature we observe in objects. It is a rule we apply in organizing temporal sequences. When events occur one after another repeatedly, the understanding employs the category of causation to interpret this sequence as necessary connection. Hume was right that we never observe necessity. But necessity is not supposed to be observed. It is imposed by the mind as a condition of coherent experience. This answer preserves science while accepting Hume's empiricist constraints. Scientific laws describe how objects must appear to beings with our cognitive structure. They do not describe things in themselves, but within the realm of possible experience they hold necessarily. Newton's laws are not contingent generalizations. They are necessary features of phenomenal reality. Reality as structured by human cognition. The Wolffian mistake was claiming that reason could know things in themselves. Leibniz and Wolff thought that metaphysics revealed the ultimate nature of reality. Monads, pre-established harmony, the best of all possible worlds. They treated reason as capable of transcending experience. Hume showed this was impossible. Kant agreed, but turned the limitation into a foundation. We cannot know things in themselves. We can know the necessary structure of experience. That is enough to secure science. Metaphysics had to be reconceived. Traditional metaphysics asked questions about God, the soul, freedom, and the cosmos. It claimed to answer these questions through pure reason. Kant argued that such questions transcend possible experience. The categories apply only to objects of experience. God is not an object of experience. The soul is not an object of experience. Freedom, in the sense of spontaneity uncaused by prior events, is not an object of experience. Reason inevitably asks these questions, but it cannot answer them theoretically. This led to the famous antinomies. When reason tries to answer metaphysical questions, it generates contradictions. Consider whether the universe has a beginning in time. You can prove it does. An infinite past is impossible because an infinite series cannot be completed. You can also prove it does not. If the universe began, something must have existed before to cause the beginning, so there was no absolute beginning. Both proofs seem valid. Both conclusions contradict each other. The antinomy arises because reason has overstepped its bounds. It treats the universe as a thing in itself rather than as a field of possible experience. The solution? Recognize the limits of theoretical reason. Metaphysical questions about things in themselves are unanswerable. This does not mean they are meaningless. It means they belong to a different domain. Kant called this domain practical reason, the domain of action and morality. Here, freedom, God, and immortality reappear as postulates necessary for moral life. But that belongs to ethics, not to theoretical philosophy. The awakening from dogmatic slumber was not conversion from one system to another. It was recognition that the old approach to metaphysics was fundamentally mistaken. Wolff tried to deduce reality from concepts. Hume showed that concepts without experience are empty. Kant added that experience without concepts is blind. Knowledge requires both. Sensibility provides content. Understanding provides form. Neither alone suffices. This insight transformed not just epistemology but the entire philosophical project. Philosophy could no longer claim to reveal the ultimate nature of reality. It could analyze the structure of human cognition, the conditions under which knowledge is possible, the limits beyond which reason cannot go. This was a humbler task, but a securer one. Kant called it critical philosophy, philosophy that examines its own capacities before pronouncing on the world. The impact on Kant's contemporaries was electric. Young philosophers recognized that something unprecedented had occurred. The old battles between rationalists and empiricists seemed obsolete. Kant had not sided with either. He had reframed the debate. Within a decade, German philosophy was dominated by Kant's questions. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel would push Kantian themes in new directions, often abandoning Kant's caution about metaphysics. But the starting point remained Kant's critical turn. Hume never knew his role in this revolution. He died in 1776, 5 years before the Critique appeared. Reports suggest that Kant's early reputation in Britain was minimal. The Critique was not translated into English until 1838. But in Germany, Kant became the philosopher one had to reckon with. Even those who rejected his conclusions accepted that philosophy after Kant could not ignore his questions. The relationship between Hume and Kant is often described as thesis and antithesis. Hume: reason is impotent. Custom governs belief. Kant: reason is legislative but only within the bounds of experience. The description is too simple. Kant did not refute Hume. He agreed with Hume's demolition of rationalist metaphysics. He agreed that experience cannot justify causal necessity. He disagreed that this makes causation merely psychological. The disagreement rested on asking a different question. Hume asked what experience teaches. Kant asked what experience presupposes. Both questions are legitimate. Both answers are partially correct. The tension between them defines modern philosophy. Kant's critique of pure reason opens with a sentence that became famous. There can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. This sounds like empiricism. It sounds like Locke or Hume. But the next sentence qualifies it. But though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. The distinction is crucial. Knowledge begins with experience in time. An infant has no knowledge. Sensory encounters with the world provide the first material for cognition. Without experience, the mind would have nothing to think about. Kant never denied this. He was not a rationalist claiming that reason alone delivers knowledge. He insisted that sensory input is necessary. But necessary is not sufficient. Experience provides raw material. It does not provide structure. Sensations bombard us continuously. Colors, sounds, pressures, temperatures. These sensations are chaotic. They do not arrive pre-organized into objects, causes, substances. The mind must organize them. This organization is not learned from experience. It is the condition under which experience becomes coherent. Consider an infant seeing a rattle for the first time. Light reflects from the rattle, enters the eyes, stimulates the retina. Sensory nerves transmit signals to the brain. The infant experiences what? Not yet an object, not yet a rattle, only a manifold of sensations, colors, shapes, movements. To perceive an object, the infant must unify these sensations. Different moments of seeing must be connected. Spatial parts must be related. The result is the perception of a unified thing. This unification requires activity. The mind synthesizes the sensory manifold. It applies rules that connect sensations into objects. These rules are not themselves experienced. They operate in the background, enabling experience without appearing within it. Kant called them the categories. 12 categories appear in the Critique, grouped into 4 classes: quantity, unity, plurality, totality, quality, reality, negation, limitation, relation, substance, causation, interaction, modality, possibility, existence, necessity. These concepts are not abstracted from experience. They are imposed on experience. They structure sensory input into a world of objects standing in relations. Take substance. We perceive a table. The table changes. Light shifts. Temperature varies. We see it from different angles. Yet we perceive one table, not a series of disconnected snapshots. The category of substance unifies these perceptions. It interprets changing appearances as properties of an enduring thing. Without this category, we would experience only flux. The idea of an object persisting through change requires the concept of substance. Take causation. We see lightning, then hear thunder. This sequence repeats. The category of causation interprets the sequence as necessary connection. Lightning causes thunder. The connection is not observed in the events themselves. It is supplied by the understanding. Without causation, temporal sequences would be arbitrary. We could not distinguish genuine causal order from accidental succession. Take interaction. We perceive multiple objects occupying space simultaneously. A table, chairs, walls. These objects coexist. They influence each other. A chair rests on the floor. The floor supports the chair. This mutual influence is not directly perceived. It is conceptualized. The category of interaction structures our understanding of how objects relate in space. The categories are a priori. A priori does not mean innate. Kant was not claiming that infants are born with explicit knowledge of substance or causation. He was claiming that the capacity to apply these concepts is built into human cognition. As soon as we have experience at all, these concepts are already operating. We cannot have experience without them. This resolves the problem Hume raised. Hume asked how we derive causation from experience. Kant answered that we do not. Causation is a condition for having experience of an ordered world. Hume was right that no impression corresponds to necessary connection. Kant agreed, but he denied that this makes causation illusory or merely habitual. Causation is a rule the understanding applies in organizing temporal data. The same applies to space and time. Hume treated them as dimensions in which impressions occur. Kant argued they are forms of intuition. Intuition means immediate acquaintance, the direct reception of sensory input. Form means structure imposed by the subject. Space is the form of outer intuition. Time is the form of inner intuition. Objects appear in space. Mental states occur in time. But space and time themselves are not objects or states. They are the conditions under which objects and states appear. Geometry reveals the nature of space. Euclidean geometry states that the angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees. This is necessarily true. But how do we know it? Not by measuring triangles. Measurement is always approximate. We know it by analyzing the structure of space itself. Space, as the form of outer intuition, has Euclidean structure. Geometric truths are necessary because they describe this form. Arithmetic reveals the nature of time. Counting occurs in sequence. You count 1, then 2, then 3. The sequence is temporal. Numbers themselves are constructions in time. Arithmetic truths are necessary because they describe operations in temporal succession. 7 plus 5 equals 12 not by definition but by constructing the sum through temporal synthesis. This explains synthetic a priori knowledge. Kant distinguished two kinds of truth. Analytic truths are true by definition. Bachelors are unmarried is analytic. The predicate is contained in the subject. Synthetic truths add information. The table is brown is synthetic. Brown is not part of the concept of table. Hume accepted only two sources of knowledge, relations of ideas, which are analytic, and matters of fact, which are empirical. Analytic truths are certain but empty. Empirical truths are substantive but uncertain. Kant argued for a third category, synthetic a priori. These are truths that add information yet are necessarily true. Every event has a cause is synthetic a priori. Causation is not part of the concept of event. Yet the statement is necessarily true because causation is a condition for experiencing events in an ordered temporal sequence. 7 plus 5 equals 12 is synthetic a priori. 12 is not contained in the concepts 7 plus and 5, yet the statement is necessarily true because it follows from the temporal construction of number. Mathematics and science both involve synthetic a priori knowledge. Newton's laws describe how objects must behave within the framework of space, time, and causation. They are not merely empirical generalizations. They are necessary features of phenomenal reality. This secures science without claiming to know things in themselves. The framework Kant proposed was revolutionary. Experience does not teach us about a ready-made world. It presents raw data. The mind structures that data according to innate rules. The world we know is phenomenal, appearance, reality, as filtered through our cognitive apparatus. We cannot know noumena, things as they are independently of this apparatus. But we can know phenomena with certainty because the same structures that make experience possible also make science possible. Critics immediately objected. If space, time, and causation are imposed by the mind, how do we know the world really has these features? Kant's answer: we do not. The world in itself might be nothing like our experience of it. But this is not a defect. We can only know what appears to us under the conditions of our cognition. Asking what the world is like apart from those conditions is asking a question we cannot answer. Others asked how the categories apply to sensory input. If categories are concepts and sensations are not, how do they connect? Kant introduced the schematism, a mediating procedure that translates categories into temporal patterns. The schema of causation is temporal succession according to a rule. The schema of substance is permanence in time, but the schematism is one of the most obscure parts of the critique. Even sympathetic readers struggled to understand it. Still others questioned whether the categories are complete or correctly derived. Kant claimed to deduce them systematically from the forms of judgment in logic, but the deduction seemed arbitrary. Why 12 categories and not more or fewer? Later philosophers, especially Hegel, argued that Kant simply borrowed the categories from traditional logic without justification. Despite these problems, the core insight endured. Experience is not passive reception, it is active construction. The mind brings structure to sensory chaos. Without this structure, there would be no coherent experience, no objects, no world. This does not make the world illusory. It makes the world phenomenal, appearance organized by cognitive capacities. Science studies this phenomenal world. It discovers the laws governing how objects must appear to us. That is real knowledge, even if it is not knowledge of things in themselves. Hume and Kant thus offered opposing accounts of experience. Hume saw a stream of impressions connected by habit. Kant saw sensory manifolds structured by a priori forms and categories. Hume made the mind passive. Kant made it active. Hume emphasized what comes from outside. Kant emphasized what the mind contributes. Both agreed that knowledge has limits, but Hume's limits led to skepticism softened by natural belief. Kant's limits led to secure knowledge bounded by possible experience. Hume opened Book 1 of the treatise with an analysis of the self. The result was one of philosophy's most radical denials. There is no self. The idea of a persisting unified subject is fiction. The argument followed Hume's empiricist method. All ideas derive from impressions. What impression gives rise to the idea of self? Hume examined his own experience. He found perceptions, thoughts, sensations, emotions. He never found a self having these perceptions. When he looked inward, he observed particular mental contents, never a substrate underlying them. He concluded that the self is nothing but a bundle of perceptions. Imagine observing your own consciousness. Right now, you might notice visual sensations, the feeling of the chair beneath you, thoughts about what you are reading, perhaps hunger or fatigue. These are discrete perceptions. Now search for the self that has them. You find more perceptions, the thought, I am searching, the feeling of effort, but you never encounter a pure self, a subject distinct from its perceptions. The self dissolves into its contents. Hume compared the mind to a theater where perceptions appear and disappear, but the metaphor was imperfect. A theater has a stage on which performances occur. The mind has no stage. There are only the performances. Perceptions succeed one another with inconceivable rapidity. Memory connects them. Imagination associates them. We mistake this association for a unifying self, but the unity is fictitious. This challenged common sense and philosophical tradition. Descartes had grounded certainty on the thinking self. I think, therefore I am. The self was the one thing immune to doubt. Locke defined personal identity through continuity of consciousness. A person is the same over time if they remember past experiences. Even Berkeley, who denied material substance, affirmed spiritual substance. The soul was real even if matter was not. Hume rejected all of this. The self is not a substance. It is not an enduring entity. It is a convenient label for a series of associated perceptions. Personal identity is a matter of resemblance and causation among perceptions. We trace a thread of connected mental states and call it a self, but the connection is loose. Memory is fallible. Consciousness is interrupted by sleep. The infant and the adult bearing the same name share few perceptions. What makes them the same person? Only gradual transition and causal continuity, not any underlying unity. The implications were disturbing. If there is no self, who is morally responsible? If identity is just association, does punishment make sense? If the self is a fiction, what survives death? Hume did not address these questions systematically. He offered a psychological account and left the consequences for others to explore. In the appendix to the treatise, Hume admitted dissatisfaction with his account. He could explain how perceptions are associated. He could not explain what unifies them into a single consciousness at each moment. Two perceptions happening simultaneously are both mine, but what makes them both mine? Association explains temporal connection. It does not explain simultaneous unity. Hume confessed that this problem seemed insoluble. He offered no solution. Kant read Hume and recognized the difficulty. A bundle theory cannot account for the unity of consciousness, but Kant's response was not to affirm a substantial self like Descartes. It was to argue that the unity of consciousness is a condition for experience, not a discoverable entity. The argument appears in the transcendental deduction, the most difficult section of the critique. Kant distinguished between inner sense, the flow of mental states, and apperception, the awareness that these states belong to a single subject. Apperception is not an additional perception. It is the condition under which perceptions can be connected. Consider having two thoughts. The sky is blue and the grass is green. These thoughts are distinct, yet you know they are both your thoughts. How? Not by observing a self that has them, but by the fact that they can be combined in a single consciousness. You can think, I'm aware that the sky is blue and the grass is green. This combination requires unity. Without it, there would be no single experience, just isolated mental fragments. Kant called this the transcendental unity of apperception. Transcendental means necessary for the possibility of experience. Unity means that all my representations can be accompanied by I think. Apperception means self-awareness. The transcendental unity of apperception is the condition that makes it possible for diverse perceptions to belong to one consciousness. This unity is not observed, it is presupposed. Hume was right that introspection reveals only perceptions, not a self. But Hume overlooked that introspection itself presupposes unity. To search for the self, you must already be a unified consciousness capable of conducting the search. The unity is not an object of experience. It is the subject, the I, that has experience. Kant did not claim this I is a substance. He explicitly rejected the rational psychology that tried to prove the soul's simplicity, immateriality, and immortality from the unity of consciousness. Such proofs were invalid. They treated the I as a thing in itself. But the I is only the formal unity of thought. It is not an entity. It is a logical requirement. This distinguished two concepts of self. The empirical self is the self as it appears in inner sense, the flow of mental states over time. This self is observable. It changes, develops, remembers, and forgets. It is phenomenal, subject to the same conditions as external objects. Hume's bundle theory applies here. The empirical self is a series of associated perceptions. The transcendental self is the self as the subject of experience, the I think that accompanies representations. This self is not observable, it is not phenomenal. It is the condition for having a phenomenal world at all. Without it, there would be no possibility of unifying perceptions into experience. It is not a substance but a function, the act of synthesis that binds representations together. Kant's account solved Hume's problem. Hume could not explain how perceptions belong to a single consciousness. Kant argued that belonging to a single consciousness is a precondition for being perceptions at all. A perception that cannot in principle be connected to I think is not a perception for me. It does not enter my experience. The transcendental unity ensures that all my representations are mine in a non-trivial sense. But this unity raises new questions. If the transcendental self is not observable, how do we know it exists? Kant's answer, we do not know it in the sense of theoretical knowledge. We cannot prove its existence as we might prove a mathematical theorem, but we must presuppose it. Without it, experience would be impossible. The unity of consciousness is not an optional feature. It is built into the structure of cognition. Another question, does the transcendental self persist over time? Kant was ambiguous. The empirical self clearly persists, or seems to, through memory and bodily continuity. But the transcendental self is not in time. It is the condition for experiencing time. Asking whether it persists is asking the wrong question. Persistence is a temporal concept. The transcendental self is not temporal in the way objects are. This created tension with practical life. In morality, we hold people responsible for past actions. Responsibility assumes identity over time. But if the transcendental self is outside time, how does it connect to the temporal person who acts? Kant addressed this in his ethical writings. He argued that moral responsibility requires freedom, and freedom requires a noumenal self not determined by natural causation. But the connection between transcendental self, noumenal self, and empirical self remained murky. Critics attacked from both sides. Empiricists said Kant had invented a metaphysical fiction to solve a problem Hume had correctly dissolved. There is no need for a transcendental self. The unity of consciousness is just tight association among perceptions. Kant's elaborate apparatus adds nothing. Idealists said Kant did not go far enough. If the transcendental self structures all experience, why not say it creates experience? Why maintain the distinction between self and world? Fichte and Hegel developed this line, arguing that the self posits both itself and its object. Kant's thing in itself became an embarrassment, a leftover from pre-critical thinking. Kant tried to walk a middle path. Against Hume, he insisted that unity of consciousness requires more than association. It requires a unifying act, synthesis. Against rationalists, he insisted that this unifying act does not reveal a substantial soul. It reveals only the formal condition of experience. The debate over personal identity continues. Contemporary philosophy of mind asks whether consciousness requires a unified self or whether the self is an illusion constructed by the brain. Neuroscience reveals that the brain processes information in parallel, distributed across regions. There is no central location where everything comes together. This seems to support Hume, yet the subjective experience of unity persists. This seems to support Kant. The dispute cannot be settled by introspection alone. Hume looked inward and found only perceptions. Kant agreed but argued that looking inward presupposes the unity being sought. Both made valid points. Hume described what appears in consciousness. Kant described the conditions under which anything can appear. Different questions, different answers. The self as bundle and the self as unity are not contradictory if they refer to different levels of analysis. Newton published the Principia in 1687. The work transformed natural philosophy. It unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics under universal laws. It explained planetary orbits, tides, the motion of projectiles, the behavior of pendulums. It did so mathematically, deriving predictions from axioms. The predictions were confirmed. Newtonian physics became the model of scientific knowledge. But what justified Newton's laws? They were not self-evident truths like logical axioms. They were not mere descriptions of observations. They claimed universality and necessity. Every body attracts every other body with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. This held always and everywhere. How could Newton know this? Hume's skepticism threatened the foundations. Scientific laws are established through induction. We observe many instances and generalize. We see apples fall, planets orbit, tides rise. We infer a universal law of gravitation. But induction assumes that nature is uniform, that unobserved instances resemble observed ones. This assumption has no rational justification. The future might differ from the past. Natural laws might change tomorrow. Science, on Hume's account, is sophisticated habit. It summarizes past regularities. It cannot guarantee future ones. Kant found this conclusion intolerable. Newton's physics worked. It predicted eclipses decades in advance. It explained phenomena across vast scales. This could not be mere custom. Scientific knowledge had to be objective and necessary. Yet Hume's arguments seemed airtight. Kant needed to show how science could be certain without claiming to know things in themselves. The solution lay in the Copernican revolution. Copernicus explained planetary motions by changing perspective. Instead of the Earth at the center, the Sun at the center. Kant proposed a similar shift for epistemology. Instead of the mind conforming to objects, objects conform to the mind. Not objects in themselves, but objects as experienced. The mind imposes structure on experience. Science discovers this structure. Newton's laws describe how objects must behave within the framework of space, time, and causation. Space and time are forms of intuition. Causation is a category of understanding. These are not features of things in themselves. They are conditions of possible experience. But because they are conditions, they apply necessarily to everything experienced. Science articulates the rules governing phenomenal reality. Consider the law of causation. Every event has a cause. Hume said this is not logically necessary and not empirically justified. Kant agreed on both points, but he argued it is transcendentally necessary. An event is a change in the state of an object over time. To experience change as objective, we must distinguish it from subjective succession. When I walk around a house, I see different sides successively. This is subjective. The sides coexist, my viewing them is successive. When I watch a ship move downstream, the successive perceptions correspond to objective change. The ship really moves. How do we distinguish these cases? Kant argued that objective change requires the concept of causation. We interpret a temporal sequence as objective when we judge that the order is necessary, that the later state must follow the earlier according to a rule. This rule is causal law. Without causation, we could not distinguish objective events from subjective associations. Causation is therefore a condition for experiencing an objective world. This validated scientific laws of a certain kind. Laws expressing causal connections are necessary because causation itself is necessary for experience. Newton's first law, a body in motion remains in motion unless acted upon, expresses a causal principle. It describes how changes in motion require external causes. This is not an empirical generalization. It is a necessary feature of how we must interpret motion. But not all scientific laws are pure. Some involve empirical content that must be discovered through observation. The specific value of gravitational constant cannot be derived a priori. It must be measured. The number of planets cannot be deduced from the concept of planet. It must be counted. Science combines a priori principles with empirical data. Kant distinguished three kinds of principles. Mathematical principles govern the construction of objects in space and time. Every object has extensive magnitude. It occupies space, endures through time. Every sensation has intensive magnitude, degree of reality, such as temperature or brightness. These principles are a priori. They follow from the forms of intuition. Dynamical principles govern relations among objects. The principle of causation states that every alteration has a cause. The principle of substance states that the quantity of substance remains constant. The principle of interaction states that substances in space determine each other's states. These principles are also a priori. They follow from the categories. Empirical laws are specific causal regularities discovered through observation. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at standard pressure. Light travels at a constant speed. These laws are contingent. They might have been otherwise, but they are not arbitrary. They instantiate the a priori principles. Specific causal laws fall under the general principle of causation. Specific substances fall under the general principle of substance. Empirical science discovers particulars within a necessary framework. This explained the certainty of Newtonian physics. The general structure, objects in space and time interacting causally, is necessary. The specific laws, inverse square gravitation, conservation of momentum, are empirical but not merely contingent. They are necessary within the phenomenal realm. They describe how objects must appear given our cognitive structure and the empirical facts. Hume's skepticism thus missed the mark. Hume analyzed causation as a relation between distinct events and found no necessity. Kant analyzed causation as a condition for experiencing events at all and found necessity there. Hume asked what we observe. Kant asked what makes observation possible. Different questions yield different answers. But Kant's account faced problems. If space, time, and causation are imposed by the mind, can science claim objectivity? Kant said yes. Objectivity does not mean correspondence to things in themselves. It means universal validity for all possible experiencers with our cognitive structure. Newton's laws are objective because they describe the necessary structure of human experience. They are not subjective preferences. They are shared constraints. Critics questioned whether this is enough. If another species had different cognitive structures, would they experience different laws? Kant's answer seemed to be yes. The laws governing their phenomenal world might differ, but humans share the same cognitive structure. For us, Newtonian laws are objective and necessary. The problem deepened with non-Euclidean geometry. Kant claimed Euclidean geometry is necessarily true because it describes the structure of space as a form of intuition. But mathematicians in the 19th century developed consistent non-Euclidean geometries. If alternative geometries are possible, space does not have a unique necessary structure. Kant's claim that geometry is synthetic a priori became doubtful. Einstein's relativity further challenged Kant. Space and time are not separate, absolute frameworks. They form a unified space-time that curves in the presence of mass. The structure of space-time is empirical, discovered through observation, not imposed a priori. Causation becomes local, not universal. Simultaneity is relative to reference frame. None of this fit Kant's account. Yet Kant's core insight survived. Science requires both empirical input and conceptual structure. Pure empiricism cannot explain the necessity of scientific laws. Pure rationalism cannot explain how laws apply to the world. Some synthesis is needed. Kant's specific proposals about space, time, and causation may be wrong, but the general idea that the mind contributes structure to experience remains influential. Contemporary philosophy of science distinguishes laws of nature from accidental regularities. Why is all gold has atomic number 79 inches a law, while all the coins in my pocket are copper is not? Both are universal generalizations. Humeans struggled to explain the difference. Kantians argue that laws express necessary connections, even if not metaphysically necessary. They are necessary within the conceptual framework we use to organize experience. Kant also anticipated the distinction between theories and observations. Observations are theory-laden. We do not perceive raw sense data, we perceive objects, and perceiving objects involves applying concepts. A scientist observing a cloud chamber sees particle tracks, not merely vapor trails. The seeing involves theoretical interpretation. This idea became central in 20th century philosophy of science. Hume and Kant thus offered opposing accounts of scientific knowledge. Hume saw induction as psychologically inevitable but rationally unjustified. Science is refined habit, useful but uncertain. Kant saw science as objectively valid within the realm of possible experience. It discovers the necessary structure that makes experience coherent. Both agreed that science does not reveal things in themselves, but Hume treated this as limiting science to probability. Kant treated it as securing science within its proper domain. The problem of the external world asks whether anything exists beyond our perceptions. The question seems absurd. Of course, tables, trees, and mountains exist independently of our awareness. We do not create the world by thinking about it. Yet philosophy has found the problem surprisingly difficult. Berkeley denied material substance entirely. Objects are collections of ideas. To exist is to be perceived. The table exists when someone perceives it. When no one looks, God perceives it, sustaining its existence. Berkeley argued that matter as an unperceivable substrate behind ideas is unintelligible. We only ever encounter ideas. Postulating something beyond them is empty. Hume was more cautious but no less skeptical. He applied his empiricist method. What impression gives rise to the idea of external existence? We have impressions of colors, shapes, textures. We never have an impression of externality itself. We cannot step outside our minds to compare perceptions with external objects. All we know are perceptions. Yet we naturally believe in external objects. The belief is irresistible. When you leave a room and return, the furniture seems to have persisted in your absence. The belief is not justified by reason. It arises from imagination. When perceptions are constant and coherent, the mind feigns continuous existence. When different people report similar perceptions, the mind posits a common cause. These are psychological mechanisms, not logical inferences. Hume distinguished three features we attribute to external objects: continued existence, distinct existence, and independence. Continued existence means objects persist when unperceived. Distinct existence means they are separate from perceptions. Independence means they exist regardless of whether anyone perceives them. We believe all three, but Hume argued that none is justified by experience. The argument from perceptual variation reinforced skepticism. A table looks different from different angles, distances, lighting conditions. Which appearance reveals the table as it really is? If we say the table is rectangular, we privilege one perspective over others arbitrarily. If we say the table is all its appearances, then its shape changes constantly. If we say the table is something distinct from all appearances, we postulate something we never perceive. Hume concluded that belief in external objects is natural but not rational. The mind is built to form such beliefs. They are useful for survival. They enable coherent action. But they have no foundation in reason or experience. This was skepticism of a peculiar kind. Hume did not deny that we believe in external objects. He denied that we have any good reason for believing. Kant read this and saw a scandal. Philosophy should not leave such a fundamental question unanswered. Either external objects exist or they do not. Skepticism about their existence is not a viable position. Kant set out to refute what he called idealism, the view that the external world is doubtful or unknowable. But Kant's refutation was not a return to naive realism. He did not argue that we directly perceive things as they are in themselves. He accepted that we know only appearances. The refutation of idealism turned on showing that awareness of one's own existence presupposes awareness of something permanent outside oneself. The argument appears in a section called The Refutation of Idealism, added to the second edition of the Critique. Kant distinguished two kinds of idealism. Dogmatic idealism denies the existence of matter. Problematic idealism treats matter's existence as doubtful and unprovable. Berkeley held dogmatic idealism. Descartes held problematic idealism. He could doubt external objects but not his own thinking. Kant argued that even awareness of one's own existence in time requires something permanent. In a sense, the awareness of one's mental states presents a succession of representations. Thoughts come and go, feelings arise and fade. To be aware of this succession as a temporal sequence, you must determine time relations. Earlier and later require a fixed reference point. This reference cannot be the succession itself, which is what needs ordering. It must be something permanent. The permanent cannot be purely internal. If it were, it would be just another item in the succession. The permanent must be external, something that persists independently of one's mental states. Therefore, awareness of one's own existence presupposes awareness of permanent external objects. The external world is not an inference from inner experience. It is a condition for having inner experience in the first place. The argument is compressed and difficult. Critics immediately questioned whether it works. Does temporal awareness really require external permanence? Could memory provide the needed stability? Could the pure forms of intuition themselves be the permanent reference? Kant did not address these objections in detail. The argument also relies on the distinction between inner and outer sense. Inner sense gives awareness of mental states. Outer sense gives awareness of objects in space. But if spatial objects are only appearances, how does Kant avoid the very idealism he is refuting? His answer: outer objects are empirically real, even if they are transcendentally ideal. They genuinely exist in space. They are independent of individual perceptions. But space itself is a form imposed by the mind. This distinction between empirical reality and transcendental ideality is central to Kant's entire system. Empirical reality means objects exist within experience, in space and time, subject to causal laws. A tree in the forest exists whether or not anyone perceives it at this moment. It has properties, occupies space, persists through time. Transcendental ideality means that space, time, and the categories are contributions of the mind, not features of things in themselves. The distinction allows Kant to accept skeptical arguments at one level while rejecting them at another. Hume was right that we cannot know things in themselves. Kant agreed. But Hume was wrong to conclude that external objects are doubtful. External objects are empirically real. They are the only objects we can know. The mistake is treating them as things in themselves and then finding that knowledge impossible. This satisfied few philosophers completely. Idealists said Kant's thing in itself was incoherent. If we can know nothing about things in themselves, we cannot even coherently posit their existence. The thing in itself should be eliminated. Fichte took this step, arguing that the self posits both itself and its object. The external world is a creation of the transcendental ego, not something independent. Realists said Kant's concession to idealism was unnecessary. We do perceive external objects directly. Perceptual experience gives us access to mind-independent reality. Later philosophers like Thomas Reid argued for direct realism. We perceive objects, not ideas. The object itself is present in perception. There is no veil of ideas separating mind from world. Kant's position was intermediate. Against dogmatic idealism, external objects exist. Against naive realism, we know them only as appearances. The external world is real but phenomenal. This sounds contradictory. How can something be real if it is appearance? Kant's answer: reality is not the same as being a thing in itself. Reality means existing in space and time according to causal laws. Appearance does not mean illusion. It means object as structured by cognition. The problem of the external world persists in contemporary philosophy. Neuroscience shows that perception is constructive. The brain processes sensory input, interprets it, fills in gaps. We do not passively receive images of the world. We actively construct perceptual experience. This seems to support Kant. What we perceive is phenomenal, shaped by cognitive processes. Yet realists argue that perception, though constructive, is still of external objects. The construction makes us aware of real things. It does not create those things. A photograph is constructed by the camera's mechanisms, but it still represents an external scene. Perception constructs representations, but the representations are of mind-independent objects. The debate turns on what external means. If external means outside the mind as a spatial container, then Kant's argument may succeed. Spatial objects are external in the sense that they are presented as outside the body and independent of individual will. If external means mind-independent in a stronger sense, existing as they are regardless of any cognitive structuring, then Kant's position is more problematic. Phenomenal objects depend on the forms of intuition and categories. Without human cognition, there would be no space, time, or causation. In that sense, phenomenal objects are not entirely mind-independent. Kant tried to have it both ways. Empirical objects are independent of individual minds, but not independent of mind in general. The tree exists when no one looks at it, but it exists in space, and space is a form of human sensibility. This is coherent if you accept the framework. It is questionable if you do not. Hume's skepticism was more modest. He did not deny external objects. He denied that belief in them has rational justification. We believe because nature compels us, not because reason convinces us. This is psychologically honest but philosophically unsatisfying. If the belief is unjustified, why trust it? Hume said we have no choice, but this makes knowledge rest on non-rational foundations. Kant's response elevated those foundations to transcendental conditions. We do not merely happen to believe in external objects. The possibility of experience requires them. Inner awareness presupposes outer awareness. Self-knowledge presupposes world knowledge. This is stronger than Hume's naturalism, but requires accepting Kant's entire critical apparatus. Neither solution has won universal assent. The problem of the external world remains open. We seem trapped inside our own perceptions, unable to verify that they correspond to independent reality. Yet the belief in such reality is inescapable. Philosophy oscillates between skepticism and various forms of realism, neither fully satisfying. Newton treated space and time as absolute. Space is an infinite container in which objects are located. Time is a universal flow in which events occur. Objects move through space. Events happen in time. Space and time exist independently of their contents. Even in an empty universe, space and time would persist. This view supported Newtonian physics. Absolute space provided a fixed reference frame. Absolute time allowed universal simultaneity. Leibniz rejected absolute space and time. Space is nothing but relations among objects. Time is nothing but relations among events. In an empty universe, there would be no space or time. Leibniz argued that absolute space violates the principle of sufficient reason. If space were a real container, why would God place the universe in one location rather than another? The question has no answer because space itself is not real. Only spatial relations are real. Berkeley agreed that space is not an independent substance. Extension exists only as a property of perceived objects. Since objects are ideas, space is the order of ideas. Time, similarly, is the succession of ideas. Both depend on perception. Without minds, neither would exist. Hume treated space and time as dimensions in which impressions occur. Visual impressions are spatially extended. Perceptions succeed one another temporally, but Hume did not analyze what space and time are in themselves. He focused on how we form ideas of them. The idea of space comes from the arrangement of visible or tangible points. The idea of time comes from the succession of perceptions. Both ideas are derived, not original. Kant's account was more radical. Space and time are neither substances nor relations nor empirical concepts. They are pure forms of intuition. This means they are structures imposed by the mind prior to any particular experience. The argument for space begins with geometry. Geometric propositions are necessarily true. The interior angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees. This is not an empirical discovery. We do not measure many triangles and generalize. We know it a priori. But geometric truths are also synthetic, not analytic. The concept of triangle does not contain the sum of its angles. The truth must be discovered through construction. How is synthetic a priori knowledge possible in geometry? Kant's answer: geometry describes the structure of space, and space is the form of outer intuition. When we construct a triangle in imagination or on paper, we are constructing in space. The construction reveals necessary features of spatial structure. Since space is imposed by the mind, its structure is knowable a priori. Since the structure is non-trivial, geometric truths are synthetic. The same reasoning applies to arithmetic and time. Counting requires temporal succession. You count 1, then 2, then 3. Arithmetic operations occur in time. The truths of arithmetic are synthetic a priori because they describe necessary features of temporal construction. 7 plus 5 equals 12, not by definition, but by successive addition in time. Space and time are therefore transcendentally ideal. They are not features of things in themselves. They are the forms under which things must appear to us. We cannot experience objects except as spatial. We cannot experience events except as temporal. This is not a limitation we might overcome. It is the structure of human sensibility. But space and time are empirically real. Objects genuinely are in space. Events genuinely occur in time. The tree really is 10 meters away. The meeting really is at 3 o'clock. These are objective facts about the phenomenal world. Kant was not denying the reality of space and time within experience. He was analyzing their status as conditions of experience. This theory had striking consequences. First, space and time apply only to appearances, not to things in themselves. We cannot ask where or when things in themselves are. Such questions are meaningless. Second, space and time are inseparable from experience. We cannot conceive of objects without spatial properties. We cannot conceive of events without temporal order. Third, the structure of space and time is fixed. Euclidean geometry necessarily describes phenomenal space. Linear time necessarily structures phenomenal succession. Critics immediately objected. If space and time are subjective forms, how do multiple minds share the same spatial and temporal world? Kant replied that all humans have the same cognitive structure. Space and time are subjective in the sense of being mind-dependent, but universal across human minds. They are not private or arbitrary. Another objection. If space is a form of intuition, why does physics study it empirically? Why measure distances, test geometric predictions, investigate space-time structure? Kant's response: empirical science studies the spatial properties of particular objects, not space itself. We discover empirically how objects are arranged in space, but that they must be in space is a priori. The most serious challenge came from developments in mathematics and physics. Non-Euclidean geometries were discovered. In hyperbolic geometry, the angle sum of a triangle is less than 180 degrees. In elliptic geometry, it is more. These geometries are internally consistent. If Euclidean geometry is the only necessary structure, how can alternatives be coherent? Kant's defenders argued that non-Euclidean geometries are abstract conceptual systems. They do not describe possible experiences. Phenomenal space remains Euclidean. But this defense weakened when Einstein showed that physical space is non-Euclidean. General relativity describes space-time curvature. The geometry of the universe is an empirical question. It depends on mass distribution. Relativity also challenged the separation of space and time. Newton and Kant treated them as distinct. Einstein unified them into space-time. Simultaneity is relative to reference frame. Time dilation and length contraction make space and time interdependent. The structure is not fixed a priori. It is discovered through observation and theory. These developments forced revision of Kant's specific claims. Space and time are not necessarily Euclidean and independent, but some philosophers argue that Kant's core insight survives. Experience requires framework. We cannot perceive objects without spatial structure or events without temporal structure. The particular geometry might vary. The necessity of some geometry remains. This interpretation treats Kant's forms of intuition as variable rather than fixed. Different cognitive systems might structure experience differently. Humans evolved to perceive approximately Euclidean space because that approximation worked at everyday scales. But the underlying structure is more complex. Science reveals this complexity. It does not refute the idea that experience requires structuring. Others argue that modern physics undermines Kant completely. Space-time is a physical entity, not a mental form. It has causal powers. It curves, bends, carries gravitational waves. This is incompatible with treating it as a subjective condition. Space and time are real features of the mind-independent world. We discover them empirically, not impose them a priori. The debate reflects deeper questions about the relationship between mind and world. If space and time are mental contributions, then the world as we experience it is fundamentally mind-dependent. Science studies phenomenal reality, not reality as it is in itself. If space and time are objective features, then science studies mind-independent structure. We discover what is there, not constructed. Hume avoided these issues. He treated space and time pragmatically. We have ideas of them derived from experience. Whether they exist independently is a question we cannot answer. The ideas are useful. That suffices for practical purposes. Philosophical disputes about their ultimate status are idle. Kant could not accept this. The status of space and time affects the status of knowledge. If they are objective, empiricism is right. We learn about space and time through observation. If they are subjective forms, transcendental idealism is necessary. Knowledge requires both sensory input and mental structure. The dispute is not idle, it determines the nature of human cognition. Both philosophers agreed that we cannot experience spaceless or timeless reality. We are bound to spatial and temporal frameworks. But Hume saw this as a fact about human psychology. Kant saw it as a fact about the structure of possible experience. The difference shaped their entire philosophical systems. Kant called his critical philosophy a tribunal. Reason must judge itself. It must determine its own powers and limits. Without such self-examination, reason overreaches. It claims knowledge beyond its capacity. The result is dogmatism or skepticism, false certainty or paralyzing doubt. The critique of pure reason mapped the boundaries of theoretical knowledge. Theoretical reason concerns what is, what exists, matters of fact. It asks questions like, does God exist? Is the soul immortal? Did the universe have a beginning? Is everything determined by prior causes? These are metaphysical questions. They transcend possible experience. No observation can settle them, yet reason inevitably asks them. The questions arise naturally from the desire to complete knowledge, to reach ultimate explanations. Kant called ideas about such matters transcendental ideas. Transcendental here means going beyond the bounds of experience. Three transcendental ideas dominate metaphysics: the soul, the cosmos, and God. Rational psychology concerns the soul. Rational cosmology concerns the universe as a whole. Rational theology concerns God. Traditional metaphysics claim to answer questions about all three through pure reason. Kant argued that such claims are illusory. The argument proceeded in stages. First, Kant showed that the categories apply only to objects of possible experience. Categories like causation, substance, and necessity are rules for organizing sensory input. Without sensory input, they are empty. They cannot deliver knowledge of things beyond experience. Second, Kant analyzed attempts to prove conclusions about the soul, cosmos, and God. He showed that these attempts commit systematic errors. They treat ideas as objects. They apply categories beyond their legitimate domain. They generate contradictions that reveal reason's overreach. The critique of rational psychology targeted Descartes and the tradition following him. Rational psychology tried to prove the soul's simplicity, immateriality, personality, and immortality from the unity of consciousness. The I think accompanies all my representations. This I seems simple, not composite. It seems immaterial, not physical. It seems to persist as the same subject. Therefore, the soul is a simple, immaterial, immortal substance. Kant called this a paralogism, a fallacy. The I think is merely the formal unity of consciousness. It is not a perception of a substance. We cannot infer from the logical unity of thought to the metaphysical simplicity of the soul. The transcendental subject is a condition for experience, not an object within experience. Treating it as an object leads to error. The soul as we experience it in inner sense is phenomenal. It exists in time. It has changing states. It is subject to causal laws. The soul as thing in itself is unknowable. We cannot prove it is simple or immaterial. Such proofs confuse the transcendental and empirical, the condition of knowledge with an object of knowledge. The critique of rational cosmology generated the antinomies. An antinomy is a pair of contradictory propositions, each of which can be proven. Reason proves both sides, then finds itself in conflict. Kant identified 4 cosmological antinomies. The first concerns time. Thesis: the world has a beginning in time. Proof: if the world had no beginning, an infinite time has elapsed before now, but an infinite series cannot be completed. Therefore, the world must have begun. Antithesis: the world has no beginning. Proof: if the world began, something must have existed before to cause the beginning. But then, there was no absolute beginning. Therefore, the world is eternal. The second concerns space. Thesis: space is composed of simple, indivisible parts. Proof: if everything were composite, nothing simple would exist. But composites require simples. Therefore, simples exist. Antithesis: nothing simple exists. Proof: if something is in space, it has parts outside parts. Whatever has parts is composite. Therefore, nothing in space is simple. The third concerns causation. Thesis: not everything is determined by natural causation. Some events arise from freedom. Proof: if every event has a prior cause, we face infinite regress. There is no first cause, but infinite regress is impossible. Therefore, some events must arise from spontaneous causation, freedom. Antithesis: everything is determined. Proof: if some events lacked causes, they would arise from nothing. But nothing comes from nothing. Therefore, every event has a cause according to natural law. The fourth concerns necessity. Thesis: a necessary being exists. Proof: contingent things depend on something outside themselves. If everything were contingent, nothing would explain the series. Therefore, a necessary being must exist as the ground of contingency. Antithesis: no necessary being exists. Proof: a necessary being would be either in the world or outside it. If in the world, it would be part of the causal series, hence contingent. If outside, we could know nothing of it. Therefore, no necessary being exists. Each antinomy presents apparently valid proofs for contradictory conclusions. Kant argued that the contradictions arise from treating the world as a thing in itself. The proofs assume that the world is a completed totality given independently of experience. But the world is not such a totality. It is the sum of possible experiences. Experiences are never complete. They extend indefinitely. The solution differs for different antinomies. The first 2 involve mathematical questions about size. Kant argued that both thesis and antithesis are false. The world as thing in itself neither has nor lacks a temporal beginning. It is neither finite nor infinite in space. These concepts apply only to appearances. We can extend experience indefinitely in time and space, but we never encounter the world as a completed whole. The third and fourth involve dynamical questions about causation and necessity. Kant argued that both thesis and antithesis can be true if applied to different domains. Within the phenomenal world, everything is determined by natural causation. No necessary being appears as an object of experience, but things in themselves might include free causation and necessary existence. We cannot know that they do, but we can think it without contradiction. This distinction between phenomena and noumena resolved the antinomies, but at a cost. Metaphysical questions remain unanswerable by theoretical reason. We cannot prove the soul's immortality. We cannot determine whether the universe is finite or infinite. We cannot establish freedom or necessity. Theoretical reason reaches its limit. The critique of rational theology targeted proofs of God's existence. Kant identified three types of argument: ontological, cosmological, and physico-theological. All fail. The ontological argument claims that God's existence follows from the concept of God. God is defined as the most perfect being. Existence is a perfection. Therefore, God must exist. Kant objected that existence is not a predicate. It is not a property that things have or lack. Saying that something exists adds no content to the concept. 100 real dollars are not more dollars than 100 imagined ones. They are the same in concept. The difference is not in the concept, but in reality. Therefore, existence cannot be derived from the concept of God. The cosmological argument claims that the existence of contingent things requires a necessary being as their cause. Kant objected that this assumes the causal principle applies beyond experience. It also collapses into the ontological argument. To identify the necessary being as God requires arguing that only a perfect being can be necessary. But this uses the ontological argument's move from concept to existence. The physico-theological argument, or argument from design, claims that the order and purpose in nature require an intelligent designer. Kant admitted this argument has intuitive appeal, but it proves at most an architect who arranges pre-existing matter. It does not prove a creator who produces matter from nothing. It does not prove perfection, infinity, or uniqueness. To reach the traditional God, the argument must supplement itself with cosmological and ontological reasoning, inheriting their flaws. All attempts to prove God's existence through theoretical reason fail. This does not prove atheism. It proves agnosticism about theoretical knowledge. God's existence cannot be known or disproven by reason analyzing concepts or experience. The question lies beyond theoretical knowledge. Kant's conclusion was humbling. Reason has definite limits. It can know objects of possible experience with certainty. Beyond experience, it cannot know at all. This does not make metaphysical questions meaningless. It makes them impervious to theoretical answer. The questions remain because reason's structure generates them, but theory cannot satisfy them. This opens space for practical philosophy. If God, freedom, and immortality cannot be known theoretically, perhaps they can be approached practically. Morality might provide grounds for belief where theory cannot. Kant called these practical postulates. They are not knowledge but rational faith, belief grounded in moral necessity rather than theoretical proof. Critics attacked the limits Kant imposed. Rationalists said Kant gave up too easily. Reason can know reality beyond appearance if properly used. Hegel argued that Kant's antinomies result from fixed categories. Dialectical thinking can resolve contradictions and reach absolute knowledge. Reason is not limited to phenomena, it can comprehend the whole. Empiricists said Kant conceded too much. Why preserve things in themselves at all? Why not eliminate noumena and accept that phenomenal reality is all reality? The thing in itself is a useless concept. It names something unknowable, hence empty. Subsequent philosophers often dropped it. Others argued that Kant's critiques of traditional proofs were devastating, but his positive account was weak. Destroying metaphysics leaves a void. The transcendental idealism meant to fill it is itself a metaphysical theory. Kant claimed not to do metaphysics while building a metaphysical system. This inconsistency troubled many readers. Hume never attempted such a systematic critique of reason. He analyzed particular concepts and found them wanting. He did not map reason's entire domain or pronounce on its limits in general. His skepticism was piecemeal. Causation lacks justification. The self is a fiction. External objects are uncertain. But Hume did not claim a comprehensive theory of knowledge. Kant saw this as unsatisfying. Skepticism about everything leaves no ground to stand on. Selective skepticism lacks principle. What justifies doubt in some areas but not others? Kant wanted a principled account of what can and cannot be known. The critique provided that account. Knowledge is possible within experience. Beyond experience, knowledge is impossible. This was not arbitrary skepticism. It was systematic limitation based on analysis of cognitive structure. The two approaches remain in tension. Hume's naturalistic skepticism is philosophically modest but practically inert. We know the limits of reason but proceed as if we do not. Kant's critical philosophy is ambitious and systematic but requires accepting a complex metaphysical framework. The limits of reason depend on accepting transcendental idealism. If you reject the framework, the limits may shift. Hume is often read as a pure skeptic, a philosopher who demolished traditional beliefs and offered nothing in return. This reading is incomplete. Hume did undermine rationalist metaphysics. He showed that causation, the self, and external objects lack rational foundation. But he also built a positive theory of human nature. We are not creatures of pure reason. We are creatures of habit, sentiment, and instinct. The treatise bore the subtitle, An Attempt to Introduce the Experimental Method of Reasoning into Moral Subjects. Moral subjects meant human nature, not just ethics. Hume proposed to study the mind empirically, as Newton had studied motion. Observation would reveal regularities. These regularities would constitute the science of man. The method began with introspection. Examine your own mental operations. Notice patterns. Generalize cautiously. This was not pure introspection divorced from behavior. Hume observed how people actually think and act. He drew on history, literature, ordinary life. The result was naturalistic psychology, an account of cognition grounded in how humans actually function. Custom emerged as the central mechanism. Custom is the tendency to form expectations based on repeated experience. See fire produce heat many times, you expect it again. This is not reasoning from premises to conclusions. It is automatic association. The mind connects ideas that have appeared together frequently. When one idea appears, the other follows automatically. Hume called this principle the association of ideas. 3 principles govern association: resemblance, contiguity, and causation. Resemblance connects similar ideas. A portrait brings to mind the person portrayed. Contiguity connects ideas experienced together in space or time. Mentioning a room in a house brings to mind adjacent rooms. Causation connects ideas as cause and effect. Thinking of a wound brings to mind pain. These principles are not conscious choices. They operate involuntarily. You cannot prevent ideas from associating once the principles are triggered. This makes belief largely passive. We do not decide to believe based on evidence rationally evaluated. We find ourselves believing based on habitual connections the mind has formed. Causal reasoning exemplifies this. You place your hand near flame and feel heat. Repeat this. The mind associates flame with heat. Next time you see flame, the idea of heat arises automatically. You believe flame causes heat. This belief is not a conclusion from logical premises. It is a psychological compulsion produced by repeated conjunction. Hume distinguished belief from mere conception. You can conceive of fire producing cold. You can imagine it vividly, but you do not believe it. What makes belief different? Not additional ideas. Belief and imagination have the same content. The difference is in the feeling. Belief is a livelier, firmer conception. It strikes the mind with more force. This force comes from custom. Ideas associated with present impressions gain vivacity. They feel real. This explained why belief is not voluntary. You cannot choose to believe fire produces cold no matter how hard you try. The associative mechanisms determine belief. These mechanisms operate below conscious control. They are built into human cognitive architecture. Evolution shaped them because they promote survival. Organisms that learn from experience survive better than those that do not. Hume thus naturalized epistemology. He did not ask whether beliefs are justified by logical standards. He asked what causes beliefs. The answer? Psychological mechanisms produced by nature. These mechanisms are not infallible. They can mislead, but they work well enough for practical life. Perfect rationality is unattainable. Functional cognition is enough. This account extended beyond causal reasoning. Belief in external objects arises from custom and imagination. Certain perceptions are constant and coherent. The furniture in your room appears the same each time you enter. The mind feigns continuous existence to explain this constancy. The belief is not rationally justified, but it is naturally inevitable. The same applies to personal identity. You remember past experiences and anticipate future ones. The mind connects these memories and anticipations into a continuous narrative. It postulates a self as the subject of this narrative, but the self is a convenient fiction. What exists are associated mental states, not an underlying substance. Yet you cannot help believing in the self. The associative mechanisms compel it. Hume's account made reason less central than philosophers had assumed. Reason in the narrow sense is the comparison of ideas and the deduction of consequences. Mathematics and logic operate by reason alone. But in matters of fact, reason is nearly impotent. It cannot establish causation. It cannot prove external existence. It cannot discover the self. These beliefs depend on non-rational mechanisms. Hume famously wrote that reason is the slave of the passions. Reason can discover means to ends. It can calculate consequences, but it cannot determine ends themselves. Ends come from desires, sentiments, passions. You want food because hunger drives you. Reason figures out how to obtain food, but reason alone cannot make you want it. Motivation is non-rational. This challenged the rationalist tradition. Plato had argued that reason should govern appetite and emotion. Reason grasps the good. It directs action accordingly. Medieval philosophy placed reason above passion. Descartes treated reason as the essence of human nature. Spinoza identified freedom with rational understanding. All these views elevated reason to primacy. Hume reversed the hierarchy. Passions provide motives. Reason serves them. This does not make humans irrational beasts. It makes us creatures whose rationality is bounded and instrumental. We reason about means, not ultimate ends. Morality does not come from reason discovering moral truths. It comes from sentiments like sympathy and disapproval. The positive theory of human nature had practical implications. If belief rests on custom, then changing beliefs requires changing habits. Argument alone rarely convinces. Repeated experience shapes belief more effectively than logic. This explained why philosophical skepticism cannot survive outside the study. Everyday experience constantly reinforces natural beliefs. The skeptical arguments fade when practical life resumes. It also explained religious belief. Hume analyzed religion naturalistically. People believe in gods because psychological mechanisms generate such beliefs. The mind seeks causes for striking phenomena. It attributes agency to forces it does not understand. It projects human qualities onto nature. These tendencies are natural, but they do not validate religious claims. The fact that belief arises naturally does not make it true. Hume applied the same analysis to superstition and popular errors. Testimony about miracles spreads because humans love the marvelous. Testimony is weighted by custom. We trust familiar sources more than strangers. But testimony conflicts with deeper custom, the uniformity of nature. Miracles violate natural regularities. The customs conflict. Reason must weigh them. Usually the uniformity of nature prevails. Miracle testimony is rarely strong enough to overcome it. The positive theory made Hume not a destructive skeptic, but a naturalistic psychologist. He undermined traditional rationalism, but offered an alternative. Humans function through evolved mechanisms that usually work. These mechanisms are not perfectly rational, but they are functional. Philosophy should describe them, not prescribe ideals divorced from actual human capacities. Critics objected that Hume's naturalism was self-undermining. If all belief rests on custom, what about Hume's own theories? Are they merely products of his habits? Hume could reply that his theories describe patterns observed in human nature. The description is fallible, but it is empirically grounded. Philosophical theories, like all beliefs, arise from experience and association. This does not make them false. It makes them subject to revision when new observations arise. Others objected that reducing belief to custom eliminates normativity. If we believe what custom produces, how can we criticize false beliefs? Hume's answer: by observing which customs lead to successful predictions and which do not. Science refines custom. It systematizes observations, tests predictions, corrects errors. But the underlying mechanism is still associative learning. Science is disciplined custom, not transcendence of custom. Kant read Hume's positive theory, but found it insufficient. Habit might explain psychological origins of belief. It does not explain justification. Kant wanted to show that causal reasoning is not merely habitual but necessary. The category of causation is required for coherent experience. Without it, experience dissolves into chaos. This is not a fact about human psychology. It is a condition for any possible experiencer with our cognitive structure. Kant also rejected Hume's view that reason is passive and motivationally inert. Kant argued that pure practical reason can motivate action. Recognizing moral law moves rational agents to act. Reason is not merely the slave of passion. It can legislate to the will. This required a very different view of human nature, one that emphasized rational autonomy rather than natural mechanisms. The contrast is fundamental. Hume saw humans as animals with enhanced cognitive capacities. These capacities operate through natural processes. Reason is one tool among others. Kant saw humans as rational beings whose rationality separates them from nature. Reason constitutes our dignity. It makes us ends in ourselves, not mere means. This difference shaped their ethics, politics, and anthropology. Hume's positive theory has influenced cognitive science. Modern psychology confirms that much cognition is automatic and associative. Neural networks learn patterns through repeated exposure, not logical deduction. Heuristics and biases operate below conscious awareness. Belief formation is often driven by emotional and social factors, not just evidence. These findings vindicate Hume's naturalism. But Kant's questions persist. Even if belief arises from habit, some beliefs are better justified than others. Science succeeds while superstition fails. What distinguishes them if both arise from natural mechanisms? Hume might say science uses more rigorous methods, but this just pushes the question back. What makes those methods better? Kant's answer: they conform to the necessary structures of experience. Hume lacked such an answer. Medieval philosophy grounded morality in divine command. What is right is what God commands. What is wrong is what God forbids. Human reason can discern these commands through revelation and natural law, but ultimately, moral authority comes from God. Without God, morality would be arbitrary or non-existent. The Enlightenment challenged this. If morality depends on God, does God command the good because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? The first horn makes goodness independent of God. The second makes morality arbitrary. Either way, the divine command theory faces problems. Philosophers sought secular foundations for ethics. Hume and Kant both attempted this. Both rejected divine command theory. Both argued that morality is accessible to human reason or sentiment without revelation. But they diverged radically on what grounds morality. Hume argued that morality is based on sentiment, not reason. Moral judgments are expressions of approval or disapproval. These sentiments arise from human nature. We are social creatures. We sympathize with others. We feel pleasure at their happiness and pain at their suffering. This sympathy is the foundation of moral evaluation. Consider an act of cruelty. You witness someone torturing an animal. You feel disapproval. This feeling is not a judgment derived from reasoning. It is an immediate response. The act produces pain. You sympathize with the victim. You feel displeasure. You judge the act wrong. The judgment expresses your sentiment. It does not describe an objective moral fact independent of sentiment. Hume distinguished reason and sentiment carefully. Reason alone cannot motivate action. You can know that a certain act produces certain consequences, but reason alone does not make you care about those consequences. Caring requires sentiment. If you feel no sympathy, no desire, no aversion, reason is powerless. It can show means to ends, but cannot establish ends. Moral distinctions depend on sentiment. When we call an act virtuous, we mean it produces approval in us. When we call it vicious, we mean it produces disapproval. These sentiments are not arbitrary. They are rooted in human nature. All humans have capacity for sympathy. All prefer pleasure to pain. These commonalities make morality universal within our species. But universality does not imply objectivity. Moral properties are not in actions themselves. They are in the sentiments actions produce in observers. An action is not cruel in the way a rock is hard. Cruelty is the disapproval felt by those who contemplate the action. Remove sentient observers and moral properties vanish. Hume called this a quasi-realist position. Moral language sounds objective. We say murder is wrong as if stating a fact, but we are really expressing sentiment. The objectivity is projected. We mistake the uniformity of human sentiment for objective moral facts. This raised questions. If morality is sentiment, can we criticize sentiments? If someone feels no sympathy, can we say they are wrong? Hume answered that most humans do feel sympathy. Those who do not are abnormal. Psychopaths lack normal moral sentiments. We can call them defective, not because they violate objective standards, but because they lack capacities typical of human nature. Another question: why should I be moral if morality is just sentiment? If I feel no sympathy for strangers, what grounds obligation? Hume's answer: most people do care about others. Sympathy extends beyond immediate family. Social life depends on cooperation. Self-interest and sympathy align. You benefit from living in a society where people treat each other well. This gives prudential reason to cultivate moral sentiments. But Hume admitted that sympathy has limits. We sympathize more with those near us than distant strangers. We favor our own group over outsiders. Morality requires correcting these biases. We adopt a general point of view, evaluating actions by their general tendency rather than particular effects on us. This correction is possible because humans are capable of impartiality. But the capacity rests on sentiment, not reason. Virtue for Hume is whatever character trait produces approval. 4 categories of virtue emerged: traits useful to others, benevolence, justice, fidelity; traits useful to oneself, prudence, temperance, industry; traits agreeable to others, wit, politeness, cheerfulness; traits agreeable to oneself, self-esteem, tranquility. All are virtues because all produce approval when we contemplate them. Justice receives special treatment. Hume argued that justice is an artificial virtue. Natural virtues like benevolence arise spontaneously. Artificial virtues like justice require social convention. In a state of abundance, where everyone has enough, justice is unnecessary. In small groups bound by affection, generosity suffices. But in large societies with scarce resources and limited sympathy, rules of property and contract are needed. These rules are not natural, they are human inventions, but they are not arbitrary. They serve social utility. Everyone benefits from stable property rights. The convention of justice arises from self-interest, not from natural sympathy. Once established, it generates approval. We admire just persons and condemn thieves, but the approval follows social utility. Hume's account was naturalistic and anti-foundationalist. Morality is not deduced from first principles. It is not commanded by God. It emerges from human sentiments shaped by social life. These sentiments are facts about human psychology. They ground moral evaluation without requiring objective moral properties. Kant found this account horrifying. It made morality contingent on human feelings. If human nature were different, morality would be different. This violated the universality and necessity that morality requires. Moral laws must bind all rational beings, not just humans who happen to have certain sentiments. Kant's ethics rested on reason alone. Morality is not about what produces approval or happiness. It is about duty, obligation, what reason commands. A moral action is done from duty, not from inclination. Acting from sympathy has no moral worth. Only acting from recognition of moral law has worth. This stark view followed from Kant's analysis of the good will. The only thing good without qualification is a good will. Intelligence, courage, wealth, all can be used for evil. Only the will to do right is unconditionally good. And a good will is one that acts from duty, from respect for moral law, regardless of consequences or desires. Moral law for Kant is rational law. It is not discovered through experience. It is derived from the nature of rational agency. A rational agent is one who acts for reasons. Reasons must be universalizable. What I claim as a reason for me must be a reason for anyone in similar circumstances. This generates the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative has several formulations. The most famous, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This means, before acting, ask whether everyone could act on the same principle. If universal adoption would be impossible or self-defeating, the action is wrong. Consider lying. If everyone lied when convenient, trust would collapse. Communication would become impossible. Lying depends on others generally telling the truth. Therefore, lying is self-defeating when universalized. It is wrong. Consider breaking promises. If everyone broke promises when inconvenient, promising would cease to function. No one would trust promises. The institution would collapse. Therefore, breaking promises is wrong. The categorical imperative tests maxims for consistency. It does not appeal to consequences. Even if lying produced better outcomes, it would be wrong. Even if keeping a promise harmed people, it would be right. Morality is not about maximizing happiness. It is about acting on principles that reason can universalize. Kant offered other formulations. The humanity formula: act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This prohibits using people as tools. It demands respect for rational agency. Every person has dignity. Dignity is not a price. It cannot be traded away for utility. The kingdom of ends formula: act as if you were legislating for a kingdom of all rational beings. Imagine a community where everyone follows only universalizable principles. Your actions should fit this ideal community. This emphasizes moral autonomy. You are both subject to moral law and its author. You legislate for yourself through reason. Kant's ethics was austere. It denied moral worth to actions done from love, sympathy, or happiness-seeking. Only duty counts. This seemed cold. Hume's ethics seemed warmer, grounded in natural human feeling. But Kant insisted that morality must be unconditional. Feelings change. Reason does not. Only reason can ground universal law. The contrast is stark. Hume: morality is rooted in sentiment, social, natural, contingent on human psychology. Kant: morality is rooted in reason, autonomous, necessary for all rational beings. Hume: virtue is what produces approval, varies with circumstances, aims at utility. Kant: virtue is acting from duty, invariant across circumstances, aims at respect for law. Both agreed that morality does not require God, but for different reasons. Hume: morality is natural, not supernatural. We evaluate by sentiment, not divine command. Kant: morality is rational, not revealed. We discover duty through reason, not scripture. God is not needed to ground moral law. If anything, moral law grounds belief in God as a postulate of practical reason. Neither view has won universal acceptance. Hume's sentimentalism faces the problem of relativism. If morality is sentiment and sentiments differ, how do we resolve disagreement? Hume appealed to common human nature, but human nature admits considerable variation. Some cultures approve practices others condemn. Hume lacked resources to adjudicate. Kant's rationalism faces the problem of motivation. Why should I do what reason commands if I do not care? Kant insisted that rational beings necessarily care about consistency. But psychopaths are rational in instrumental reasoning, yet lack moral motivation. Kant lacked resources to explain this, except by denying they are fully rational. Modern ethics draws on both. Consequentialism echoes Hume's emphasis on utility and natural sentiment. Deontology echoes Kant's emphasis on duty and universal law. Virtue ethics combines elements of both. The debate continues. But both Hume and Kant established that morality can be secular, grounded in human nature or reason rather than divine authority. Hume and Kant both wrote on politics. Both lived through the early stages of modernity, the rise of commerce, the weakening of feudalism, Enlightenment challenges to authority. Both witnessed revolutions. Hume observed the Jacobite rebellions. Kant lived through the French Revolution. Their political philosophies reflected their divergent views of human nature and morality. Hume approached politics empirically. He observed governments historically and drew conclusions about what works. Human nature is constant. Institutions vary. Some institutions channel human tendencies productively. Others produce conflict and oppression. Good government accommodates human nature rather than trying to transform it. Human beings are motivated by self-interest, passion, and limited sympathy. We care most about ourselves and those close to us. We pursue advantage. We respond to incentives. Reason plays a small role in most human behavior. Habit and sentiment dominate. Any political theory ignoring these facts will fail. Hume rejected social contract theory. Locke and Rousseau imagined humans in a state of nature, contracting to form society. Hume called this fiction. Humans never existed outside society. We are born into families, communities, traditions. Authority arises gradually through custom and acquiescence, not through explicit agreement. Asking whether government rests on consent is asking the wrong question. It rests on utility and habit. Government is necessary because human sympathy is limited. In small groups bound by kinship, cooperation arises naturally. But in large societies among strangers, self-interest threatens order. Property conflicts arise. Without enforcement, agreements break down. Government provides the enforcement. It protects property, enforces contracts, punishes violations. But government itself poses dangers. Rulers are human. They pursue their own interests. Concentrated power invites abuse. The challenge is designing institutions that make self-interest serve the common good. Hume admired the British Constitution for its balance of powers. Monarchy, aristocracy, and commons each check the others. No faction can dominate. Self-interest counteracts self-interest. Hume defended commerce and property. Trade increases wealth. Wealth supports refinement, arts, sciences. Commercial societies are more civilized than agricultural or warlike ones. Property rights enable planning and investment. Security of property motivates industry. Justice is artificial, but it is necessary for prosperity. On religion and politics, Hume was cautious. Religious enthusiasm breeds fanaticism. It divides society into sects. It claims authority beyond reason. Established churches are better than sects because establishment moderates zeal. A state church becomes comfortable, less dogmatic. This is preferable to competing zealous factions. Hume opposed radical change. Revolutions disrupt order. They unleash passions. The results are usually worse than the systems they replace. Reform should be gradual, working within existing structures. Tradition embodies accumulated wisdom. Sudden breaks with tradition court disaster. This conservatism reflected Hume's skepticism. Since reason cannot establish perfect systems, we should prefer tested institutions to untried theories. Since human nature is fixed, utopian schemes will fail. Since sympathy is limited, expecting universal benevolence is unrealistic. Politics should aim for stability and moderate prosperity, not perfection. Kant's political philosophy was more idealistic. It rested on the concept of right. Right is not what produces good consequences. It is what respects freedom. Every person has a right to freedom compatible with the freedom of others under universal law. Government's purpose is securing this right. Kant began with the state of nature, not as historical fact but as analytical concept. Without government, rights are insecure. Conflicts arise. Force threatens. To secure rights, individuals must leave the state of nature and enter civil society. This transition is a rational requirement, not a historical event. The social contract is an idea of reason. It is not an actual agreement. It is the standard by which laws are judged. Legitimate laws are those that all citizens could rationally consent to. If a law is such that no reasonable person could agree to it, the law is unjust. This provides a critical principle without requiring actual consent. Kant defended republicanism. Republican government combines three elements: freedom under law, equality before law, and representation. Citizens are free, not subject to arbitrary will. Citizens are equal, none privileged by birth. Citizens are represented, participating in legislation either directly or through representatives. Monarchy and aristocracy can be republican if they respect these principles. What matters is not the form of government, but its spirit. A monarch who rules according to law, treating citizens as ends, governs republicanly. A democracy that violates rights is despotic. Kant argued for the separation of powers. Legislative, executive, and judicial functions must be distinct. This prevents any single authority from becoming absolute. It embodies the idea that government serves the general will, not particular interests. On property, Kant agreed with Hume that property rights are necessary, but his justification differed. Property is an extension of freedom. To act in the world, I must use objects. Claiming exclusive use requires social recognition. Property rights are mutually recognized claims that enable free action. They are not merely useful conventions, they are requirements of justice. On revolution, Kant was ambivalent. He condemned rebellion. Citizens cannot judge their own case against the sovereign. Rebellion undermines the legal order that makes rights possible. It returns society to the state of nature. Yet Kant celebrated the French Revolution as a moral sign, evidence that humanity strives toward freedom and justice. The revolution was wrong as an act, but right as an ideal. This tension reflected Kant's philosophy. Duty forbids revolution, but history progresses toward justice. Revolution may be necessary for progress, even if unjustified for participants. Kant resolved the tension by distinguishing morality and history. Individuals must obey duty. History unfolds through human actions, including unjust ones, toward rational ends. Kant envisioned perpetual peace. War arises from the state of nature among nations. To end war, nations must form a federation, a league of republics governed by international law. This is not world government. It is voluntary association. Each republic remains sovereign but agrees to resolve disputes peacefully. Perpetual peace requires republican government domestically. Republics are less warlike because citizens bear the costs of war. When rulers decide war without consulting those who fight, wars are frequent. When citizens decide, they hesitate. Republican government thus promotes peace. Kant also argued for cosmopolitan right. Individuals have a right to hospitality when traveling. States cannot reject visitors without cause. This reflects the idea that the earth belongs to humanity as a whole. No nation owns the planet. Commerce and communication should be global. Walls between peoples should fall. The contrast with Hume is evident. Hume emphasized utility, tradition, gradual reform. Kant emphasized justice, rational principle, ideals. Hume saw politics as managing flawed human nature. Kant saw politics as realizing human dignity. Hume distrusted theory. Kant distrusted mere custom. Yet both defended constitutional government, rule of law, and property rights. Both opposed tyranny. Both valued individual liberty. The differences were in grounding and emphasis. Hume grounded politics in utility and custom. Kant grounded it in rights and reason. Hume emphasized stability. Kant emphasized progress. Critics note that Hume's conservatism supported existing hierarchies. He defended property without questioning its distribution. He accepted monarchy and aristocracy. He was skeptical of democracy. His politics reinforced the status quo. Kant's idealism faced the charge of abstraction. His principles were too pure for messy reality. His refusal to allow revolution contradicted his celebration of progress. His cosmopolitanism seemed unrealistic given human particularism. Modern political philosophy inherits both traditions. Liberal political theory echoes Kant's emphasis on rights, autonomy, and justice. Conservative and communitarian thought echoes Hume's emphasis on custom, utility, and the limits of reason. Debates over rights versus consequences, universal principles versus particular traditions reflect the Hume-Kant divide. Both acknowledge that politics must accommodate human imperfection. But Hume saw imperfection as permanent limits. Kant saw it as something to overcome gradually through reason and institutions. This difference shaped not just their politics but their visions of human potential. Kant's moral philosophy is often accused of being too abstract. The categorical imperative sounds formal and empty. How does it apply to concrete situations? Kant provided examples. They reveal both the power and the problems of his ethics. The most famous case is lying. Suppose you need money urgently. You consider borrowing with a promise to repay, knowing you cannot. Should you make the false promise? Apply the categorical imperative. The maxim is, when I need money, I will make false promises to get it. Can this be universalized? Can everyone act on this principle? If everyone made false promises when convenient, promising would collapse. No one would believe promises. The practice would destroy itself. You could not even make a false promise because no one would accept promises. The maxim is self-defeating. Therefore, lying is wrong regardless of consequences. This example is powerful. It shows how the categorical imperative generates prohibitions without appealing to outcomes. You need not calculate whether lying produces more harm than good. The test is consistency. Universal lying is impossible. Therefore, lying is forbidden. But critics immediately raise problems. Suppose a murderer asks where your friend is hiding. You know the location. Should you lie to protect your friend? Kant notoriously said no. You must tell the truth. Lying is always wrong. Your duty is not to produce good consequences. Your duty is to respect moral law. Lying violates that law. You cannot be held responsible for what the murderer does with truthful information. You are responsible only for your own adherence to duty. This answer shocked readers. It seems obviously wrong. Surely lying to save a life is permissible, even obligatory. Kant's response? You cannot know consequences with certainty. Perhaps the murderer knows you are inclined to lie and will go where you say your friend is not. Perhaps your friend has already fled. By lying, you assume responsibility for outcomes you cannot control. By telling truth, you fulfill duty and leave consequences to fate. The response is unconvincing. Kant seems to prioritize formal consistency over human life. He values duty more than people. This suggests something wrong with his system. If rigorous application leads to absurd conclusions, perhaps the principles need revision. Kant might reply that the example is misleading. The maxim is not simply tell the truth, it is tell the truth when someone asks. But murderers have no right to truth. They forfeit it by intending murder. You need not answer unjust questions. Silence or evasion might be permissible even if lying is not. This revision introduces nuance but complicates the theory. How do we determine when questions are unjust? This requires judgment about rights and circumstances. It makes the categorical imperative less purely formal. It requires considering context, not just logical consistency. Another famous example is suicide. Suppose life has become unbearable. Suffering outweighs any prospect of happiness. Is suicide permissible? Kant's answer, no. The maxim is, when life becomes burdensome, I will end it to avoid suffering. Can this be universalized? Kant argued no. Life aims at self-preservation. Using life to destroy life is contradictory. The principle defeats itself, therefore suicide is wrong. This argument is weaker than the lying example. Why is using life to end life contradictory? People use capacities to cease using them regularly. You use energy to rest. You use time to save time later. The mere fact that you employ something to terminate it is not obviously self-defeating. Critics suggest Kant confuses two things. Biological life aims at preservation. But rational persons can decide that preservation is not worthwhile. There is no logical contradiction in choosing death to escape suffering. The argument fails unless you assume life has intrinsic value that must be preserved. But that is a substantive moral claim, not a formal principle. Kant offered a stronger argument from the humanity formula. Every person has dignity. You cannot treat yourself merely as a means. Suicide treats your body as a tool to escape suffering. It fails to respect your own humanity. You are using yourself, not valuing yourself as an end. This is more persuasive but still questionable. Does suicide necessarily fail to respect humanity? Perhaps it respects autonomy, the right to determine one's own fate. Perhaps continued suffering degrades human dignity more than chosen death. Kant's argument assumes that preserving biological life always respects humanity. This is debatable. A third example concerns talents. Suppose you have gifts, intelligence, artistic ability, athletic prowess. Is there a duty to develop them, or can you waste your life in idleness and pleasure? Kant argued for a duty to develop talents. The maxim of neglect, I will not bother developing my capacities. Can this be universalized? Kant said it could, logically. A world where everyone neglected talents is conceivable, but no rational being could will it. Rationality requires having means to pursue ends. Developed capacities are necessary means. Therefore, rational beings must will the development of talents, even if they could logically will otherwise. This introduces a distinction. Some maxims are contradictory in conception. Universalizing them is logically impossible. Lying and false promising are examples. Other maxims are contradictory in will. You can conceive them universalized but cannot rationally will it. Neglecting talents is an example. The distinction is important but murky. What counts as something you cannot rationally will? Kant seemed to mean you cannot will it without contradicting your status as a rational agent with ends. But this is vague. Different people might rationally will different things. Kant needed a more robust account of rational willing. A fourth example concerns helping others. Suppose someone needs help. You could assist at little cost. Are you obligated? Kant said yes. The maxim of indifference. I will never help others. Can this be universalized? Yes, logically. A world where no one helps anyone is conceivable, but you cannot rationally will it. You are a finite being. You will sometimes need help. Willing that no one helps means willing your own abandonment in need. This is irrational. Again, the argument relies on contradiction in will, not conception. You can imagine universal indifference, but you cannot coherently will it because it conflicts with your inevitable needs. Therefore, you must will a world where help is provided. This generates an imperfect duty to help others. Imperfect means you have discretion about when and whom to help, but you must help sometimes. This argument is more plausible than the suicide case but still has problems. Suppose you are completely self-sufficient. You need no help. Can you then rationally will universal indifference? Kant would say no, because you must will what any rational being could will, not just what you personally can will. Morality is universal. Your particular circumstances do not matter. But this seems to assume what needs proving. Why must you adopt the perspective of all rational beings rather than your own? Kant's answer: because morality is rational law and rational law is universal, but this is circular. It assumes that morality is universal to prove that you must will universally. These examples reveal tensions in Kant's ethics. The categorical imperative is supposed to generate duties through formal consistency alone, but applying it requires substantive assumptions. What counts as a contradiction? What can rational beings will? These questions do not have purely formal answers. They require moral judgment. Kant also distinguished perfect and imperfect duties. Perfect duties allow no exceptions. You must never lie, never make false promises, never commit suicide. Imperfect duties allow discretion. You must develop some talents, help some people, but you choose which and when. This distinction is practically important, but theoretically unclear. Why are some duties perfect and others imperfect? Kant did not provide a clear criterion. Critics argue that Kant's examples often smuggle in consequentialist reasoning. The lying example works because universal lying has bad consequences. Trust collapses. The helping example works because universal indifference has bad consequences. Everyone suffers. If we are appealing to consequences, why not admit that consequences matter? Kant would reply that the appeal is not to consequences but to consistency. Universal lying is not wrong because it produces bad outcomes. It is wrong because it is self-defeating. The maxim cannot coherently be universalized. This is a logical point, not a consequentialist one. But the distinction is fragile. Self-defeating means the practice defeats its own purpose. Purpose is future-oriented. It concerns outcomes. Saying lying defeats the purpose of communication is saying it has bad consequences for communication. The gap between Kantian and consequentialist reasoning narrows on inspection. Another problem is determining the correct description of the maxim. In the lying case, is the maxim make false promises, or make false promises when in great need, or make false promises to prevent greater harm? The more specific the maxim, the easier it is to universalize without contradiction. Kant needed a principle for individuating maxims. He did not provide one. Despite these problems, Kant's approach has enduring appeal. It captures the intuition that morality is not just about outcomes. Some acts are wrong even if they produce good results. Lying, betrayal, exploitation feel wrong regardless of consequences. Kant's ethics honors this intuition. It treats persons as ends, not mere means. It respects autonomy and dignity. The categorical imperative also has practical advantages. It is action guiding. You can ask of any proposed action, could I will this as universal law? The test is clear, even if its application is complex. Consequentialist ethics requires predicting outcomes, weighing goods, making difficult comparisons. Kantian ethics focuses on the principle behind the action. This is often simpler. Modern deontology refines Kant's insights while avoiding his rigidities. Philosophers like W.D. Ross argued for multiple prima facie duties: truth-telling, promise-keeping, non-harm, beneficence. These duties can conflict. When they do, judgment is required to determine which takes priority. This preserves Kantian emphasis on duty while allowing flexibility. Others defend a threshold deontology. Certain acts are forbidden unless consequences are catastrophic. You should not lie in ordinary circumstances, but you may lie to prevent mass murder. This compromises strict Kantianism but seems more reasonable. It preserves the idea that some acts are specially wrong while acknowledging that extreme circumstances matter. Kant's examples remain philosophically valuable even where they fail. They show the difficulty of grounding ethics in pure reason. They reveal how formal principles require substantive interpretation. They demonstrate both the appeal and limits of duty-based ethics. Wrestling with them clarifies moral thinking, even if we reject Kant's conclusions. The problem of free will asks whether human actions are free or determined. If every event has a cause and human actions are events, then human actions are caused. But if actions are caused by prior states and laws of nature, they are not free. Yet morality seems to require freedom. We hold people responsible only for free choices. The problem is reconciling freedom with causal determinism. Hume addressed this in the Inquiry. He began by clarifying terms. By necessity, he meant constant conjunction. Necessary connection is not observed. We infer it from regular sequences. Fire follows friction. Motion follows collision. The inference rests on experience, not logic. Human actions exhibit the same regularities. Similar motives produce similar actions. People pursue pleasure and avoid pain. They act from fear, ambition, love. These patterns are as regular as physical patterns. History records them. Literature depicts them. Social life depends on them. If human behavior were random, society would be impossible. Hume concluded that human actions are caused in the same sense that physical events are caused. This is not some mysterious metaphysical necessity. It is observed regularity. Motives are causes, actions are effects. The connection is as reliable as any in nature. Does this eliminate freedom? Hume said no. Freedom is not the absence of causation. It is the absence of constraint. A free action is one that flows from the agent's desires and character without external compulsion. A prisoner in chains is not free. His movements are externally constrained. A person acting from their own motives is free even if those motives are caused by prior factors. This is compatibilism. Freedom and determinism are compatible. Determinism is true. All events, including actions, are caused. Freedom is real. We act from our own desires without external force. The two do not conflict because freedom is not uncaused action. It is uncompelled action. Compatibilism has intuitive appeal. When we ask if someone acted freely, we ask whether they were forced, threatened, or manipulated. We do not ask whether their brain states were caused by prior brain states. The ordinary concept of freedom is compatibilist. It concerns the presence or absence of external constraints, not metaphysical indeterminism. Hume applied this to responsibility. We hold people responsible because praise and blame influence behavior. Punishment deters, reward encourages. These mechanisms work because actions are caused by motives. Influencing motives changes actions. If actions were uncaused, praise and blame would be pointless. Responsibility does not require that actions be uncaused. It requires that they flow from the agent's character. We excuse people when external factors overwhelm their motives. Insanity, coercion, ignorance. We do not excuse them merely because their motives have causes. Everyone's motives have causes. This is part of human nature. Hume's account dissolved the traditional problem. There is no conflict between determinism and freedom rightly understood. The appearance of conflict arises from confused notions of necessity and freedom. Clarify the concepts and the problem vanishes. Critics objected. Compatibilist freedom seems too weak. If your desires are caused by factors outside your control, genetics, upbringing, environment, how are you responsible? You did not choose your character. Your character determines your actions. Therefore, your actions are not truly yours. You are a puppet of causal chains stretching back before your birth. Hume might reply that this proves too much. If determinism undermines responsibility, so does indeterminism. If your actions are uncaused, they are random. Random actions are not attributable to you any more than determined ones. Responsibility requires that actions flow from character. This is possible under determinism, impossible under pure randomness. But the objection persists. Your character is not self-created. It is a product of factors you did not control. How can you be responsible for what flows from a character you did not choose? Compatibilism seems to leave no room for genuine authorship of action. Kant saw this problem. He rejected compatibilism. He argued that moral responsibility requires transcendental freedom, not merely empirical freedom from external constraint. Transcendental freedom is the capacity to initiate causal chains, to act from reason rather than from prior causes. The argument rested on Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena. In the phenomenal world, everything is determined. Every event follows from prior events according to causal laws. Human actions, as events in time, are no exception. Your decision to raise your arm is caused by brain states, which are caused by prior states in an unbroken chain. But you are not merely phenomenal, you are also noumenal. As a thing in itself, you are outside time and causation. As a rational being, you can act from reason. Reason is not part of the causal chain. It is spontaneous, self-legislating. When you act from duty, from recognition of moral law, you exercise noumenal freedom. You act as a thing in itself, not as a phenomenal event. This is the two-standpoint solution. From the empirical standpoint, all actions are determined. Science studies human behavior causally. Psychology explains decisions by prior states. Neuroscience traces actions to brain processes. All of this is correct for phenomena. From the practical standpoint, you are free. When deliberating, you cannot view yourself as merely determined. Deliberation presupposes alternatives. You consider reasons, weigh principles, choose. This presupposes that you can act from reason, that reason can determine the will. Moral responsibility requires this freedom. The two standpoints do not contradict because they concern different aspects of the same action. As a phenomenal event, your decision is causally determined. As a noumenal act, it is freely chosen. Both descriptions are true from their respective standpoints. Critics found this mysterious. How can one action be both determined and free? How can a noumenal self interact with phenomenal events? If noumena are outside time, how do they relate to temporal actions? Kant admitted that transcendental freedom is incomprehensible. We cannot explain how it works. We can only recognize that morality requires it. The practical argument for freedom is this: morality requires responsibility. Responsibility requires that you could have done otherwise. But if determinism is true, you could not have done otherwise. Given prior causes, your action was inevitable. Therefore, morality requires denying or transcending determinism. Kant argued that morality does not require proving freedom theoretically. Theoretical reason cannot demonstrate freedom. The question lies beyond possible experience. But practical reason requires assuming freedom. When you deliberate, you must assume you are free. This assumption is a postulate of practical reason necessary for moral life, even if unprovable theoretically. The contrast with Hume is stark. Hume analyzed actual human decision-making and found it determined by motives. He defined freedom to fit this reality. Kant analyzed the requirements of morality and found they require transcendental freedom. He postulated a noumenal self to satisfy this requirement. Hume's approach is naturalistic. It describes human beings as parts of nature, subject to natural laws. Freedom is empirical, a matter of uncompelled action. Responsibility is practical, a matter of social mechanisms for influencing behavior. Kant's approach is transcendental. It distinguishes human beings as rational agents from human beings as natural organisms. Freedom is noumenal, a matter of rational spontaneity. Responsibility is moral, a matter of authorship grounded in reason. Neither view has achieved consensus. Modern debates continue along similar lines. Compatibilists defend Hume's approach, arguing that moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. Libertarians defend Kant's intuition that responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Hard determinists argue that neither compatibilist nor libertarian freedom is coherent, so responsibility is illusory. Neuroscience adds complexity. Brain scans show decision-making processes before conscious awareness. Libet's experiments suggested that actions are initiated unconsciously before we feel we decided. If decisions are made by unconscious brain processes, how are we responsible? Compatibilists reply that responsibility does not require conscious awareness of causal processes. It requires that actions flow from the agent's psychology, conscious or not. Your unconscious brain is still your brain. Its processes are yours. Libertarians argue that neuroscience studies the phenomenal self. It does not touch the noumenal self. Science reveals how phenomenal decisions happen. It does not address whether noumenal freedom exists. This echoes Kant's two-standpoint strategy. Hard determinists argue that science reveals no room for freedom. All mental processes are brain processes. All brain processes are physical. All physical processes are determined, or quantum random, which does not help. Therefore, freedom is illusion. Responsibility should be reconceived or abandoned. The problem remains unresolved. Hume's compatibilism captures ordinary intuitions about freedom, but may not satisfy demands for ultimate responsibility. Kant's libertarianism preserves moral intuitions but requires mysterious metaphysics. The tension between naturalism and morality that generated the problem persists. Hume's essay Of Miracles was provocative. Published in the Inquiry, it argued that belief in miracles is never rationally justified. The argument targeted Christian revelation but applied to any supernatural claim. Hume defined a miracle as a violation of natural law. Natural laws describe regularities observed without exception. Water freezes at 0 Celsius. Unsupported objects fall. Dead organisms do not revive. These regularities are established by overwhelming evidence. Millions of observations confirm them. No contrary instances are reliably reported. A miracle violates these regularities. Water turns to wine without chemical process. A person walks on water without sinking. A corpse returns to life. Such events contradict natural law. For this reason, evidence for them faces special scrutiny. Hume's argument was epistemological, not metaphysical. He did not claim miracles are impossible. He claimed we should never believe they occurred based on testimony. The argument turned on weighing evidence. Evidence for any claim is the reliability of testimony or the frequency of similar events. For ordinary claims, these support each other. Someone reports seeing snow. Snow is common. Testimony is reliable. Belief is justified. Someone reports seeing a talking dog. Testimony may be honest, but talking dogs are unknown. The extraordinary nature of the claim outweighs the testimony. For miracles, the imbalance is extreme. Testimony, however reliable, is fallible. People make mistakes, exaggerate, lie. Even the best testimony has some probability of error, but natural laws are established by uniform experience. Every observed case confirms them. 0 cases contradict them. To believe a miracle based on testimony, the falsity of the testimony must be more miraculous than the miracle itself. The witness must be so reliable that their error would violate laws of human psychology as firmly as the miracle violates laws of nature. This never occurs. Human error and deception are common. Miracles are, by definition, rare. Hume offered 4 supporting considerations. First, no miracle has sufficient witnesses. Miracle claims come from ancient times, distant places, uneducated people. If miracles occurred in modern, educated societies before multiple credible witnesses, the case would be stronger. But they do not. They occur in circumstances where verification is impossible and credulity is high. Second, humans love the marvelous. We are attracted to surprising stories. We exaggerate. We pass along rumors uncritically. Superstition spreads easily. This is a fact about human psychology. It reduces the reliability of miracle testimony. Extraordinary claims are exactly where human unreliability is greatest. Third, miracles are reported primarily in ignorant nations. Civilized societies with scientific education report fewer miracles. This suggests that miracles are products of misunderstanding and credulity, not genuine violations of natural law. As education spreads, miracle reports decline. This is evidence that they were never real. Fourth, miracle reports from different religions cancel each other. Christians report miracles supporting Christianity. Muslims report miracles supporting Islam. Hindus report miracles supporting their gods. Each religion's miracles are evidence for its truth, but they contradict each other. They cannot all be true. The best explanation is that all are false, products of the same human tendency to manufacture supernatural stories. Hume concluded that the wise proportion belief to evidence. Evidence for miracles is always weaker than evidence for natural law. Therefore, miracles should never be believed on testimony. This does not prove they never happened. It proves we should not believe they did. The argument was devastating for traditional Christianity. Christian theology rested on revelation. Christ's miracles authenticated his divine mission. Resurrection was the foundation of faith. If miracles are never rationally credible, Christianity lacks rational foundation. Hume was arguing that religious belief cannot be based on reason. It must be based on faith, in the sense of belief without or against evidence. Critics responded vigorously. Some argued that Hume's argument proves too much. If we never believe unusual testimony, we cannot believe historical claims about rare events. But we do believe that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, even though that specific event is unique. Hume seemed to make all historical knowledge impossible. Hume might reply that historical events, however specific, are not violations of natural law. A person crossing a river is consistent with natural law. Many people cross rivers. Caesar's case differs only in historical significance, not in natural possibility. Miracles, by contrast, violate natural regularities. This is a categorical difference. Others argued that sufficient testimony could outweigh natural law. If thousands of independent, reliable witnesses reported a miracle, belief would be justified. Hume underestimated the power of testimony, but this objection is weak. Hume's point was precisely that such testimony never actually occurs. Miracle claims always involve few witnesses, unclear circumstances, biased reporters. If overwhelming testimony existed, Hume might concede the point, but it does not. Some theologians embraced Hume's argument. Kierkegaard later argued that faith requires believing against reason. Christianity is absurd from a rational standpoint. That is why it requires faith. Hume inadvertently supported fideism, the view that religious belief is properly based on faith alone, not reason. Kant read Hume on miracles and agreed partially. Theoretical reason cannot establish miracles. Testimony is insufficient, but Kant argued that morality requires religious postulates. Belief in God, immortality, and providence is rationally necessary for moral life, even if not rationally provable. This is practical faith, not theoretical knowledge. Modern philosophy of religion still debates Hume's argument. Bayesian epistemology formalizes it. Prior probability of a miracle is extremely low. Testimony provides evidence, but not enough to overcome the low prior. Posterior probability remains low. Belief is not justified. But some argue that the prior probability cannot be determined without addressing whether God exists. If God exists and has reasons to perform miracles, the prior is higher. Hume assumed naturalism, that natural law is never violated. This begs the question against theism. Hume might reply that we must start with observed regularities. Natural law is our baseline. Postulating God to raise the prior probability of miracles is circular. We would need evidence for God independent of miracles. But such evidence is lacking, so miracles cannot establish God, and God cannot establish miracles. The debate turns on priors. Bayesian reasoning requires starting probabilities. These reflect background beliefs. Naturalists assign miracles low priors. Theists assign them higher priors. Given the same testimony, they reach different conclusions. Hume's argument is powerful for those starting from naturalism. It is less powerful for those starting from theism. Hume's essay also addressed specific miracle stories. He mentioned reports from French Catholics about healings at a shrine. He noted that Protestant scholars examined the evidence and found it unconvincing. Each side dismissed the other's miracles. This symmetry suggested that bias, not evidence, drove belief. He also noted that ancient historians reported miracles with the same confidence as modern devotees. Yet educated people dismiss ancient miracles as superstition. Why trust modern miracle claims more than ancient ones? Both come from ages and places where critical thinking is limited. Consistency demands skepticism about both. The essay's tone was ironic. Hume did not directly call believers fools. He presented himself as deferring to revealed religion while showing that reason cannot support it. This allowed him to escape charges of atheism while making his skeptical point. But readers understood the subtext. Rational persons should not believe miracle claims. Faith, if it exists, must be divorced from evidence. Kant's first critique limited theoretical knowledge. We cannot know God, freedom, or immortality. Metaphysics as knowledge of things in themselves is impossible. But this was not Kant's final word. Practical reason, the reason involved in action and morality, restores what theoretical reason denies. The argument appeared in the Critique of Practical Reason and the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Morality is not based on consequences or sentiment. It is based on rational law. The categorical imperative commands unconditionally. You must do right because it is right, regardless of desire or outcome. But morality seems to require conditions the world does not guarantee. Virtue should produce happiness. The moral agent deserves to flourish. Yet we observe virtuous people suffer and vicious people prosper. The world does not reward morality. This creates a problem. If virtue does not lead to happiness, why be virtuous? Kant rejected this question as morally corrupt. You should be virtuous because duty commands it, not because it benefits you. Morality is not instrumental, it is categorical. Asking why be moral misunderstands morality. Moral law binds you regardless of consequences. But Kant admitted that complete good requires both virtue and happiness. Virtue alone is not the whole good. The virtuous person deserves happiness. A world where virtue and happiness align is better than one where they diverge. Kant called this alignment the highest good. The highest good is not a motive for virtue. You do not act morally to achieve it. You act morally because duty commands. But practical reason cannot accept that the highest good is impossible. If morality commands us to promote the highest good, practical reason requires that the highest good be achievable. Yet the world as we experience it does not guarantee the highest good. Natural causation does not connect virtue with happiness. Virtuous acts do not reliably produce flourishing. Kant concluded that we must postulate conditions under which the highest good is possible. These postulates are God and immortality. God must exist to ensure that virtue and happiness ultimately align. Only a moral intelligence governing the universe can guarantee this alignment. Nature alone is morally indifferent. Causal laws do not reward virtue. Therefore, practical reason requires believing in God as the ground of the highest good. Immortality must be real to allow moral perfection. Finite beings cannot achieve perfect virtue in one lifetime. Moral progress requires infinite time. Therefore, practical reason requires believing in immortality as the condition for endless moral development. These are postulates, not proofs. Theoretical reason cannot prove God or immortality. The ontological, cosmological, and physico-theological arguments fail. But practical reason requires assuming what theoretical reason cannot prove. This assumption is rational faith. Rational faith differs from blind faith. It is not belief without reason. It is belief grounded in practical necessity. Morality is rationally binding. If morality requires certain conditions, those conditions must be assumed. The faith is rational because it is necessary for moral life. Kant also postulated freedom. Morality requires that we can act from duty against inclination. This requires freedom from natural causation. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant argued that freedom is possible as noumenal causation. In the Critique of Practical Reason, he argued that freedom is necessary for morality. Therefore, practical reason requires assuming freedom. The three postulates, God, freedom, immortality, are not theoretical knowledge. We do not know that they are true. We cannot prove them, but we must act as if they are true. Practical reason demands it. This is faith, but rational faith grounded in the requirements of morality. Critics objected that this is wishful thinking. Kant cannot prove God or immortality, so he postulates them. He claims practical necessity justifies belief. But why should practical necessity make something true? Perhaps morality is simply tragic. Perhaps virtue does not guarantee happiness. Perhaps we should be moral anyway. Kant might reply that rejecting the highest good makes morality incoherent. If we must pursue the highest good and the highest good is impossible, morality contradicts itself. Practical reason cannot accept such contradiction. Therefore, we must assume conditions that make the highest good possible. But this assumes that ought implies can. If we ought to promote the highest good, then it must be possible. But why accept this principle? Perhaps we ought to do things that are impossible. Perhaps morality demands more than we can achieve. Kant seemed to assume that a rational moral law would not demand the impossible. Critics questioned this assumption. Others objected that the postulates are too thin to support religion. Kant's God is not the personal God of Christianity. It is a principle guaranteeing moral order. Kant's immortality is not heaven or resurrection. It is endless moral striving. These postulates do not vindicate religious tradition. They replace it with philosophical abstraction. Kant agreed that the postulates do not establish revealed religion. They establish only what practical reason requires. Christianity adds historical revelation, miracles, incarnation. These go beyond practical postulates. Kant distinguished religion within the limits of reason alone from historical faith. The postulates belong to rational religion. Historical religions add elements that reason cannot validate. This separated Kant from traditional theology. He defended rational faith but rejected much traditional doctrine. Original sin, atonement, resurrection of the body, these were historically contingent beliefs, not requirements of practical reason. Rational religion respects moral law, assumes God and immortality, and seeks moral perfection. This is enough. Kant's approach influenced liberal theology. Friedrich Schleiermacher and others argued that religion's essence is moral and experiential, not doctrinal. Historical dogmas are culturally conditioned expressions of underlying moral truths. This allowed accommodating modern science while preserving religious commitment. But conservative theologians rejected Kant's reduction of religion to morality. Christianity is not primarily about moral striving. It is about redemption, grace, divine human relationship. Kant's rational faith evacuates religion of its specific content. It makes God a moral postulate rather than a living person. This is not Christianity, but moralism. Atheist critics argued that Kant's postulates are unjustified even on practical grounds. Why believe that virtue and happiness must align? Perhaps the universe is indifferent. Perhaps there is no cosmic justice. Kant's postulates reflect human wishes, not rational requirements. We want virtue rewarded. We want life to continue. We want freedom. But wanting does not make it so. Kant's reply: practical reason is not about what we want. It is about what morality requires. If morality is rational and morality requires certain conditions, those conditions must be assumed. This is not wishful thinking. It is logical consistency. Modern debates continue. Some defend practical postulates. Moral realism requires assuming moral order. If morality is objective, the universe must support it. Otherwise, morality is subjective preference. To avoid subjectivism, we must postulate grounding conditions. Others argue that morality does not require cosmic grounding. We can have objective moral truths without God. Moral facts are natural facts about well-being, rights, and duties. These facts do not require supernatural support. Kant's leap from morality to theology is unwarranted. The debate reflects deeper questions about the relationship between ethics and metaphysics. Can ethics be self-standing, or does it require metaphysical foundations? Hume thought ethics requires no metaphysics, only human nature. Kant thought ethics requires postulates about ultimate reality. This difference shapes their entire philosophical legacies. Hume died in 1776. Kant died in 1804. Within decades, their influence diverged dramatically. Hume became the patron saint of empirical science and naturalistic philosophy. Kant dominated ethics, continental philosophy, and idealist metaphysics. The split reflects their different emphases and methods. Hume's influence on science was indirect but profound. He did not conduct experiments or develop theories. He analyzed the logic of scientific inference. His skepticism about causation forced scientists and philosophers to reconsider what scientific laws accomplish. The problem of induction became central to philosophy of science. Scientists generalize from observations. They observe many cases and infer universal laws. But Hume showed this inference lacks logical justification. No finite set of observations entails a universal conclusion. The future might differ from the past. Nature might change its patterns. Scientists largely ignored this. They continued forming generalizations because the method works. But philosophers could not ignore it. If scientific inference is rationally unjustified, what is the status of scientific knowledge? Various responses emerged. Logical positivists in the 20th century tried to reconstruct science on secure foundations. They distinguished observation statements from theoretical statements. Observation is direct, certain. Theory is indirect, fallible. Science should build theory from observation through inductive logic. But Hume's problem persisted. Inductive logic cannot deliver certainty. Karl Popper proposed falsificationism. Science does not prove theories true, it attempts to prove them false. A theory is scientific if it is falsifiable. Theories survive by withstanding attempts at refutation. This avoids induction. We do not infer from observations to theories. We conjecture theories and test them. Falsificationism became influential in 20th century philosophy of science. But falsificationism faces problems. Experiments are theory-laden. Observations depend on theoretical assumptions. Falsifying evidence can be questioned by revising auxiliary assumptions. No theory is definitively falsified by any observation. Thomas Kuhn argued that science proceeds through paradigms that resist falsification until revolutionary change occurs. This is more sociological than logical. All these debates trace back to Hume. His skepticism about induction set the agenda. Philosophy of science became largely a series of responses to Hume. Even those who rejected his conclusions accepted his framing of the problem. Hume's naturalism also influenced psychology and cognitive science. He analyzed belief formation empirically. He identified association of ideas as a fundamental mechanism. Modern psychology confirms that associative learning is basic to cognition. Neural networks learn through patterns, not deduction. This is Humean. Behaviorism was Humean in spirit. It studied observable behavior, not inner mental states. It explained learning through association, stimulus, response, reinforcement. Watson and Skinner built psychology on observable regularities, rejecting introspection. This was not identical to Hume's approach, but it shared his empiricism and naturalism. Cognitive science later reintroduced mental states, but kept naturalism. The mind is what the brain does. Cognition is computation. These are physical processes. Hume's project of studying the mind empirically as part of nature became mainstream. Dualism and rationalism faded, naturalism dominated. Hume's ethics influenced utilitarianism. Bentham and Mill argued that right actions maximize happiness. This is not identical to Hume's sentimentalism, but the emphasis on consequences, happiness, and human nature echoes Hume. Hume grounded morality in sentiment and utility. Utilitarians systematized this into a normative theory. 20th century metaphysics debated whether moral properties are natural or non-natural. Emotivism, inspired by Hume, argued that moral statements express sentiments, not facts. Murder is wrong means murder. Boo. This is not a factual claim, it is an expression of disapproval. Emotivism faced problems, but it influenced subsequent metaethics. Contemporary moral psychology is Humean. Jonathan Haidt argues that moral judgment is intuitive, not rational. We feel moral approval or disapproval instantly. Reasoning comes later, justifying intuitions. This fits Hume's picture. Sentiment drives moral judgment. Reason serves sentiment by constructing justifications. Kant's influence took different paths. His ethics became the main alternative to consequentialism. Deontology, duty-based ethics, traces to Kant. Right actions respect moral law, not consequences. Persons are ends, not means. These Kantian themes structure contemporary ethics. Rawls revived Kantian political philosophy. A theory of justice argued that principles of justice are those we would choose behind a veil of ignorance. This is a contractualist method, but Rawls called it Kantian. It treats persons as free and equal, capable of rational choice. It derives principles from what rational agents could accept. This is Kantian in spirit. Christine Korsgaard developed Neo-Kantian ethics. She argues that normativity comes from reflective endorsement. We act on principles we can reflectively accept. This requires consistency, universalizability. Morality is what we owe to each other as rational beings. This is pure Kant, updated with contemporary arguments. Kant's epistemology influenced German idealism. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel pushed Kantian themes in new directions. Fichte eliminated the thing in itself. The self posits both itself and its object. Reality is the self's construction. Hegel argued that reality is rational, developing through dialectical stages. Absolute idealism replaced Kant's critical philosophy. These developments were anti-Humean. They elevated reason over experience. They claimed to know ultimate reality, not just phenomena. They built grand metaphysical systems. This diverged from Kant's caution, but it began from his insights about the mind's constructive role. Phenomenology also has Kantian roots. Husserl studied consciousness as it appears, bracketing questions about external reality. Kant's transcendental analysis inspired this method. Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty developed phenomenology in various directions. All emphasized that experience is structured by the subject. This is Kantian. Kant influenced philosophy of science differently than Hume. Where Hume questioned induction, Kant asked, what makes science possible? The answer? A priori structures of cognition. Space, time, causation are imposed by the mind. Science discovers phenomenal regularities, not things in themselves. This inspired Neo-Kantianism in the late 19th century. Philosophers like Hermann Cohen argued that science requires categories that structure experience. Scientific knowledge is objective but phenomenal. It describes reality as it must appear to us, not reality in itself. This was Kant's position refined. But 20th century physics challenged Kant's specifics. Relativity showed that space and time are not separate, absolute forms. They are unified, dynamic, curved by mass. Quantum mechanics suggested that observation affects reality, but not in ways Kant anticipated. The a priori structures Kant identified seemed empirically false. Yet some argued that Kant's core insight survives. Science requires theoretical frameworks. Observation is theory-laden. We cannot access reality except through concepts. This is broadly Kantian, even if Kant's specific categories were wrong. The mind's contribution to knowledge remains central. The split between Humean and Kantian traditions marks a fundamental divide. Hume: knowledge comes from experience, science is empirical generalization, morality is sentiment, humans are natural beings. Kant: knowledge requires structure imposed by the mind, science discovers phenomenal necessity, morality is rational law, humans are rational agents. These are not just technical disagreements. They reflect different visions of human nature. Hume saw continuity with animals. We are more sophisticated but fundamentally similar. Instinct, habit, sentiment dominate. Reason is limited. Kant saw a radical break. Humans are rational. This gives us dignity, autonomy, moral worth. We transcend nature through reason. The visions shape responses to science. Hume welcomed naturalistic explanations of mind and morality. If psychology explains belief and ethics, this is progress. Kant resisted reduction. Morality cannot be explained by natural causes without losing its normative force. Freedom requires transcending causation. The visions also shape politics. Humean liberalism emphasizes utility, tolerance, gradualism. Society should maximize happiness and accommodate human nature. Kantian liberalism emphasizes rights, dignity, justice. Society should respect persons as ends and realize rational principles. Both visions remain influential. Analytic philosophy tends Humean, empirical, naturalistic, skeptical of metaphysics. Continental philosophy tends Kantian, focused on meaning, subjectivity, critique. This is oversimplified, but the pattern is real. Contemporary philosophy tries to bridge the divide. Pragmatists like Dewey and Rorty argued that the debate is sterile. Philosophy should focus on practical problems, not metaphysical disagreements. But the disagreements resurface. Is morality natural or transcendent? Is the mind passive or active? These questions persist. Cognitive science is largely Humean. It studies the mind as a natural system. It explains cognition through mechanisms, memory, association, heuristics. It rejects dualism and a priorism. Yet even here, Kantian themes appear. The mind imposes structure. Perception is constructive. Innate capacities shape learning. The debate continues in new forms. Ethics remains divided. Consequentialists are Humean, emphasizing outcomes and human welfare. Deontologists are Kantian, emphasizing duty and respect for persons. Virtue ethicists draw on both, or neither. Meta-ethical debates over realism and anti-realism echo Hume and Kant. Are moral facts natural or constructed? The question is theirs. The legacy split is not merely historical, it represents ongoing philosophical alternatives. Hume and Kant framed questions we still ask. Their answers still define positions we take. Understanding them is understanding the structure of contemporary debate. Artificial intelligence and neuroscience have revived the Hume-Kant debate in new forms. The central question: does intelligence come from data or structure? Do minds learn patterns from experience or impose innate frameworks on data? Machine learning is Humean. Neural networks learn from examples. Feed a network millions of images labeled cat or dog. The network adjusts connection weights to classify correctly. It learns patterns, textures, shapes, features that distinguish cats from dogs. No programmer specifies what a cat is. The network discovers it from data. This is pure association. The network forms connections between inputs and outputs based on correlation. It is sophisticated curve fitting. Given enough data and enough parameters, it approximates any function. This is induction, generalizing from observed cases to unobserved ones. Deep learning extended this. Neural networks with many layers learn hierarchical representations. Early layers detect edges, middle layers detect shapes, late layers detect objects. The hierarchy emerges from data. The learning is bottom-up, empiricist, Humean. The success is remarkable. Neural networks now recognize images, translate languages, play games at superhuman levels. They do this without hand-coded rules. They learn from experience. Hume would recognize the method. Repeated association produces expectations. The difference is scale. Networks process millions of examples. Humans process thousands. But the principle is similar. Yet neural networks have limitations. They require enormous data. They struggle with novel situations. They lack common sense. They do not generalize the way humans do. A child sees a few cats and recognizes new ones easily. A network needs thousands of examples. This suggests something is missing. The missing element might be structure. Chomsky famously argued that language learning requires innate grammar. Children acquire language too quickly from too little data. The input underdetermines the output. Therefore, minds must have innate linguistic structures. This is Kantian. Experience requires frameworks. Cognitive scientists debate nativism versus empiricism. Nativists argue that core knowledge is innate. Infants understand objects, numbers, and agents before learning. These concepts are not abstracted from experience. They are present from birth, shaping how experience is interpreted. This is Kant's categories in new form. Empiricists argue that learning is more powerful than nativists admit. Statistical learning can extract structure from data. Infants are exposed to massive regularities, language, faces, motion. Powerful learning mechanisms can discover patterns. Innate structure is minimal. Most knowledge is learned. The debate is not resolved. Both sides point to evidence. Nativists cite infant studies showing early competencies. Empiricists cite computational models showing how much can be learned. The truth is probably intermediate. Some structure is innate, much is learned. But what proportion? The question is Hume versus Kant. Bayesian cognitive science offers a synthesis. Minds have priors, initial probability distributions over hypotheses. These priors are updated by evidence. The priors are like Kantian structures. They constrain interpretation. The updating is like Humean learning. Experience modifies belief. The framework combines both. But where do priors come from? If they are innate, we are back to Kant. If they are learned from earlier experience, we are back to Hume. Bayesians often punt, saying priors reflect evolutionary history, natural selection built in useful biases. But this just pushes the question to evolution. Did evolution encode structures or learning mechanisms? Developmental psychology asks when structures emerge. Piagetian theory argued that cognitive structures develop through stages. The infant starts with simple reflexes. Through interaction, structures emerge. The categories are constructed, not innate. This is between Hume and Kant. Structures exist but are built from experience. Neuroscience finds both specialization and plasticity. Some brain regions are specialized from birth. The visual cortex processes visual input. The language areas process language. This suggests innate structure. But the brain is also plastic. It rewires based on experience. Blind people use visual cortex for hearing. This suggests learning dominates. Connectionists argue that neural networks are biologically plausible. If brains work like neural networks and neural networks learn from data, then brains are Humean. But critics note that biological brains have rich structure. They are not blank slates. Evolution built in architectures, connection patterns, learning rules. This structure is Kantian. Embodied cognition emphasizes the body's role. Cognition is not just in the head, it involves sensory motor systems. The body provides structure. We learn through bodily interaction. Categories like container and path come from physical experience. This is Humean, learning through interaction. But the body provides constraints, structure, so it is also Kantian. Artificial general intelligence debates these issues. Should AGI use deep learning, scaling up neural networks, or should it use symbolic AI with explicit rules and structures? Deep learning is Humean. Symbolic AI is Kantian. Hybrid approaches combine both. The debate reflects Hume-Kant tensions. AlphaGo combined neural networks and tree search. The networks learned from data. The search applied structured reasoning. The combination defeated human champions. This suggests both approaches are needed. Data alone is insufficient. Structure alone is insufficient. Intelligence requires both. GPT and large language models are Humean triumphs. They learn language from vast text corpora. No grammar is programmed. They predict next words based on patterns. Yet they generate coherent text, answer questions, translate languages. This suggests that statistical learning from massive data achieves understanding. But critics argue that language models lack genuine understanding. They are sophisticated parrots. They produce plausible text without grasping meaning. True understanding requires models of the world, causal reasoning, common sense. These might require structured knowledge, not just patterns. The debate is Hume versus Kant about understanding. Robotics faces similar issues. Should robots learn from scratch through trial and error? Or should they have built-in models of physics, objects, agents? Pure learning is slow, pure structure is brittle. Successful robots combine both. They have priors that guide learning. This is Bayesian, combining Hume and Kant. Neuroscience of perception supports Kant. Perception is not passive reception. The brain actively interprets sensory input. It fills in gaps, imposes structure, constructs experience. Top-down processes shape bottom-up data. This is Kantian synthesis, though implemented in neural circuits. Predictive processing theory argues that brains are prediction machines. They generate models of the world. They predict sensory input. They update models when predictions err. This combines structure, models, and learning updates. It is neither purely Humean nor purely Kantian. It integrates both. The modern debate thus echoes Hume and Kant. Is cognition pattern recognition from data, or is it structured interpretation through frameworks? The answer seems to be both. But the balance remains contentious. Some emphasize learning, others emphasize structure. The tension is productive, it drives research. Hume and Kant could not have imagined neural networks or brain scans, but they framed the question. Does knowledge come from experience or from the mind's contribution? How much is given? How much constructed? These remain central questions. Modern science has not resolved them. It has refined them and given them new forms. The debate continues. 3 centuries after their births, Hume and Kant remain indispensable. Not because they were right about everything. Both made errors. Science has corrected some. Philosophy has moved past others. But their questions and methods remain vital. Hume reminds us of human limitations. Reason is weaker than we wish. Much belief rests on habit, not logic. We generalize from limited data. We project our psychology onto the world. We form convictions that exceed our evidence. Recognizing these limits is intellectual humility. Modern overconfidence needs Hume. We trust intuitions without examining them. We accept claims that fit our biases. We ignore uncertainty. Hume's skepticism is corrective. Before asserting knowledge, ask, what is the evidence? How reliable is it? What assumptions underlie it? Often answers are less secure than we think. Hume also valued naturalism. Humans are part of nature. Understanding ourselves requires studying how we actually function. Morality arises from sentiment. Belief arises from association. These are natural facts. Philosophy should not float above science. It should engage with empirical findings about human nature. Contemporary philosophy increasingly accepts this. Ethics engages with moral psychology. Epistemology engages with cognitive science. Metaphysics engages with physics. This naturalistic turn is Humean. It treats philosophical questions as continuous with scientific ones. This is not reduction, it is integration. Hume's emphasis on sentiment in ethics remains relevant. Morality is not pure reason. Emotions matter. Empathy drives moral concern. Outrage motivates justice. Care shapes virtue. Rationalist ethics that ignores emotion misses something essential. Hume recognized that humans are feeling creatures. Morality must accommodate this. But Hume's limitations are also clear. Pure skepticism is not a viable position. We cannot act without belief. We cannot deliberate without assuming regularity. Hume knew this. He distinguished philosophical skepticism from practical life, but he did not explain how to reconcile them. The gap between theory and practice remained. Hume's metaethical view also has problems. If morality is just sentiment, disagreement seems intractable. If I approve and you disapprove, what settles it? Hume appealed to common human nature, but human nature varies. Moral progress seems impossible if morality is just collective sentiment. We need some standard beyond mere feeling. Kant provides what Hume lacks. He showed that knowledge requires structure. Experience is not passive reception. Cognition imposes organization. Without frameworks, sensations would be chaos. This insight is permanent. Modern cognitive science confirms it. Perception is constructive. Categories shape experience. The mind's active role is undeniable. Kant's ethics offers what consequentialism and sentimentalism miss. Persons have dignity. We are not mere means to others' ends. This is not a matter of utility or sentiment. It is a matter of respect. Rights are not simply useful conventions. They recognize intrinsic worth. This intuition is powerful and hard to ground without something like Kant's framework. Kant's emphasis on autonomy is also crucial. Morality is not heteronymous, imposed from outside. It is self-legislation. Rational beings govern themselves through principles they can endorse. This is freedom in the deepest sense. It is the foundation of moral responsibility. Without it, we are mere products of causes, not agents. Kant's political philosophy contributes essential ideas. The social contract is an idea of reason, not historical fact. It provides a standard for judging legitimacy. Laws should be such that citizens could rationally consent. This is the basis for democracy and human rights. Kant grounded these in reason, not tradition or utility. But Kant's limitations are also clear. His ethics is rigid. The prohibition on lying seems too absolute. Real moral life involves conflicts, trade-offs, judgment. Kant's principles provide guidance but cannot resolve every case mechanically. Moral reasoning requires practical wisdom, not just categorical imperatives. Kant's metaphysics of noumena and phenomena is problematic. The thing in itself is mysterious. If unknowable, why posit it? If it exists, how does it relate to phenomena? Kant's answers are obscure. Later philosophers drop the thing in itself, but this undermines parts of Kant's system. Without noumena, transcendental freedom is hard to locate. Kant's claim that space and time are a priori forms proved false. Relativity showed that space-time is empirical. Geometry is not synthetic a priori. It is discovered through physics. Kant's specific claims were refuted, but his general insight that some structures condition experience may survive in revised form. Both philosophers offer partial truths. Hume captures the limits of reason and the power of experience. Kant captures the mind's contribution and the demands of morality. Neither view alone is adequate. Both are needed. Contemporary philosophy seeks synthesis. Pragmatists argued that knowledge is a tool for coping with experience. It involves both empirical input, Hume, and conceptual structure, Kant. Truth is what works, but working involves both correspondence to reality and coherence of framework. Quine argued that knowledge is a web of belief. Some beliefs are closer to experience, others are more theoretical. Revision can occur anywhere, but we prefer altering peripheral beliefs. This naturalizes epistemology while recognizing that theory shapes observation. It is post-Humean and post-Kantian. Rawls's reflective equilibrium balances intuitions and principles. We start with moral judgments. We propose principles. We adjust both to achieve coherence. This combines Humean sentiment, intuitions, with Kantian reason, principles. Neither dominates. Both contribute. Moral particularism argues that principles cannot capture all of morality. Context matters. Judgment is irreducible. This is against Kant's universalism but not quite Humean sentimentalism. It recognizes moral knowledge without reducing it to sentiment or principle. Constructivism in metaethics, developed by Korsgaard and others, argues that moral truth is constructed through rational reflection. This is Kantian but less metaphysically committal. Morality is not mind-independent fact. It is what we construct through practical reasoning. This preserves Kantian autonomy without Kantian metaphysics. Naturalistic realism in metaethics argues that moral facts are natural facts. Goodness is flourishing. Rightness is cooperation. These are empirically discoverable. This is Humean naturalism but realist about morality. It combines empiricism with objectivity. These syntheses show that philosophy has not abandoned Hume and Kant. It has absorbed and transformed their insights. The debates they shaped continue. Their frameworks remain reference points. Education in philosophy still requires engaging both. Understanding empiricism requires reading Hume. Understanding rationalism requires reading Kant. Their arguments set standards for clarity, rigor, and depth. Later philosophers respond to them, refine them, reject them, but the conversation they started has not ended. In practical life, both perspectives are valuable. When assessing beliefs, ask Humean questions. What is the evidence? How reliable? What are the patterns? But also ask Kantian questions. What assumptions structure my thinking? What concepts organize my experience? How do I actively interpret data? In ethics, consider both sentiment and principle. Hume reminds us that morality involves feeling. Compassion matters. Kant reminds us that morality involves reason. Consistency matters. Good moral thinking integrates both. It respects sentiments while subjecting them to rational scrutiny. In politics, balance utility and rights. Hume's concern for consequences and stability is important. Policies should work. But Kant's concern for justice and dignity is also important. Persons should be respected. Neither alone suffices. Good politics requires both. The Hume-Kant debate is not merely historical, it is ongoing. Every generation faces it anew. Science and morality, experience and reason, nature and freedom, these tensions are permanent features of human life. Hume and Kant articulated them with unsurpassed clarity. Their works remain living texts, not museum pieces. We still need both. We will always need both.